Part 1. The Storm and the Curse. Chapter 1. A Pirate's Plight. The storm had descended upon them with the fury of a vengeful god. The thunder roared like an angry beast, its deep growls reverberating through the very core of the Crimson Tempest. Captain Adrian Blackwood stood resolute at the helm, his hands gripped tightly on the wheel, muscles straining with each violent lurch of the ship. The wind howled in a cacophony of rage, whipping his long dark hair into wild tangles. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the horizon, calculating every shift in the storm's rhythm. Each crash of thunder seemed to echo the pounding of his heart as the ship groaned beneath him. But he remained steadfast, knowing that surrender was not an option. The sea itself seemed alive, its massive waves rising like great walls to batter the sides of the ship. The Crimson Tempest pitched and tossed violently, its wooden frame creaking in protest as it was thrust and pulled by the merciless current. Adrian's jaw clenched as he fought to keep the ship steady, his boots sliding across the slick deck. The thunder crashed again, drowning out all but the pounding of the ship's timbers and the howl of the wind. Beneath him, the ship's hull groaned, its age and the years of wear on its boards evident in the way it shuddered with each strike of nature's wrath. But Adrian would not let it break. The ship was his life, and he would guide it through this chaos or die trying. The heavens above were torn asunder by the violent flashes of lightning, each bolt a jagged scar in the blackened sky. For a brief moment, the world was illuminated in a blinding flash, revealing the intense determination etched across Adrian's weather-beaten face. His brow furrowed in concentration, the lines of age and experience adding gravity to his gaze. He was no stranger to storms, but this one felt different, more insistent, more relentless. Yet in the heart of the chaos, Adrian found clarity. Every crash of thunder, every wave that threatened to engulf them, only sharpened his focus. He knew this battle with nature was a test, one he could not afford to lose. He had fought too long, too hard, to let the sea take him down now. The relentless barrage of rain lashed at Adrian's face, stinging his skin like needles, but he did not flinch. His coat, heavy and soaked through, flapped wildly behind him as he leaned into the storm's fury. His crew was scattered across the deck, struggling to secure the sails and tie down loose ropes. But Adrian's gaze never wavered from the wheel. His hands moved with a practiced grace, steering the Crimson Tempest through the treacherous waters, guiding it through the towering waves with an uncanny sense of knowing. Each tilt of the wheel, each subtle shift in the wind, was calculated with the precision of a seasoned sailor who knew how to read the sea as though it were a second language. As the storm raged on, Adrian's mind did not waver. His heart beat in rhythm with the ship's struggle, the pulse of the vessel in his blood. The storm, furious and unrelenting, was a reflection of his own inner turmoil, the battles fought and won, the sacrifices made to reach this point. The ship was his, as much a part of him as his own body, and it would not fall to the storm. With every wave that threatened to capsize them, Adrian's resolve grew stronger, his fingers tightening around the wheel as though to hold the very storm at bay. The thunder rumbled again, but this time, it sounded almost like a challenge. And Adrian, with the fierce fire of a pirate captain, met it head-on, knowing that as long as he was at the helm, the Crimson Tempest would sail on. Adrian Blackwood was a name whispered in both fear and admiration across the seven seas. His reputation as a cunning and fearless pirate captain had spread like wildfire, with tales of his daring exploits reaching even the farthest corners of the known world. His ship, the Crimson Tempest, was as infamous as its captain, cutting through the waves like a predator on the hunt. Yet, despite the fear he commanded on land and sea, there was one force Adrian could never conquer: nature's wrath. The relentless power of the storm that now surrounded him was a reminder that no man, no matter how skilled or bold, was immune to the fury of the ocean. The wind howled through the rigging with a force that seemed almost alive, bending the masts and shaking the very bones of the Crimson Tempest. The sky above was a bruised canvas of swirling black clouds, with the rain coming down in sheets, lashing against Adrian's tricorn hat and soaking him to the skin. His coat billowed around him, heavy with water, yet he stood firm, unflinching as the storm raged. The ship pitched violently, and the ropes creaked under the strain of the sails. But Adrian did not look away from the dark sea ahead. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, narrowed in concentration, scanning the chaotic waters for any sign of hope, a break in the storm, or a hint of salvation. The storm roared around him, deafening in its intensity. Each gust of wind seemed to scream through the rigging, each wave a massive wall of water threatening to engulf them whole. Adrian's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white as the ship bucked and pitched beneath his feet. The salt water stung his eyes, but he did not blink. His gaze never wavered from the horizon, where the endless black sea met the equally unforgiving sky. A lesser man might have succumbed to the overwhelming pressure, but Adrian was made of sterner stuff. He had faced dangers far worse than this before, and though the storm's ferocity was unlike any he had encountered, he refused to believe it could defeat him. In the midst of the chaos, Adrian's mind raced, calculating the ship's movements and the shifting winds. Every part of him, every instinct honed over years of battling the sea, was focused on keeping the Crimson Tempest afloat. His mind flickered to his crew, working desperately on deck, their faces set in grim determination as they fought to secure the sails. The storm was an enemy that knew no mercy, and Adrian was keenly aware that it would take more than just his skill at the helm to guide them through this. He had to rely on his crew's unwavering loyalty and strength, trusting that they would hold fast even in the face of nature's fury. He couldn't do it alone. The storm raged on, but Adrian's resolve remained unbroken. Though the wind screamed like a beast in pain and the waves threatened to swallow them whole, he stood as the unwavering center of the tempest. His eyes, dark with experience and sharpened by countless battles, cut through the storm's veil. The sea was a beast to be tamed, and Adrian Blackwood was no stranger to that challenge. He had outwitted men, kings, and entire navies. Now, it was time to outwit the storm. As the ship groaned and creaked under the strain, Adrian gritted his teeth, refusing to surrender to the storm's rage. The sea may be his adversary, but it was also the very thing that had made him the legend he was. And as long as he still breathed, he would fight it with everything he had. "Hold fast, you scallywags!" Adrian bellowed, his voice strained and rough as it fought to rise above the deafening roar of the storm. The words barely reached the ears of his crew, lost in the howling wind and crashing waves, but the sheer force behind them was undeniable. His eyes locked on the faces of his men, seeing only determination etched in their grim expressions. The ship pitched violently beneath their feet, and yet Adrian's voice cut through the chaos like a rallying cry, igniting a spark of resolve within each of them. They were pirates, seasoned by countless dangers, but this storm was unlike anything they had ever faced. Yet, Adrian's command was clear: they would not yield. The rain came down in torrents, a merciless downpour that lashed at their skin like 1,000 needles. The wind screamed through the rigging, tugging at their coats and tearing at their hair. Despite the ferocity of the storm, the crew scrambled to carry out Adrian's orders, each man working with frantic precision. Ropes were pulled taut, sails were trimmed, and every inch of the ship was secured in preparation for the battering that awaited them. It was a fight for survival, and they trusted Adrian implicitly. He was their captain, and they had followed him into countless storms before. This one would be no different, not while he still drew breath. "Stay together, damn it!" Adrian shouted again, his voice hoarse as he gripped the wheel with both hands, leaning into the ship's violent lurch. The mast creaked and groaned in protest, as if threatening to snap under the strain, but Adrian's focus never wavered. His crew, driven by his leadership, responded with renewed urgency. They moved as a single, well-oiled machine, their movements swift and practiced despite the chaos around them. The storm was a monstrous beast, clawing at the ship with its relentless fury, but Adrian knew that the key to surviving this was unity. They had weathered worse before, and they would do so again, as long as they held together. The waves crashed violently against the sides of the Crimson Tempest, sending water sluicing over the deck in torrents. The ship creaked, its timbers groaning in protest as the storm raged on, but it remained steadfast under Adrian's command. The captain's jaw was clenched, eyes fixed on the shifting horizon, his mind racing through strategies and calculations. He knew every inch of the ship, every sway of the deck, every gust of wind. His crew looked to him for direction, and he would not falter now. "We're not going down today!" Adrian roared into the wind, his voice a defiant shout against the storm's endless rage. The words were a promise, one he fully intended to keep. As the storm continued its violent assault, Adrian's resolve only hardened. His grip on the wheel tightened, fingers bloodless from the force of his hold. His coat flapped wildly behind him, soaked through by the relentless downpour, but he barely noticed. The storm's fury was immense, but Adrian knew that this was a test of will, of strength, of leadership. He had faced death more times than he cared to remember, and each time, he had stared it down with unflinching eyes. Today would be no different. He would not let the Crimson Tempest fall to the storm. With his crew at his back, their courage bolstered by his command, Adrian steeled himself for the battle ahead. Together, they would survive. Together, they would fight. The storm was unrelenting, a force of nature that showed no mercy to those caught in its fury. The crew of the Crimson Tempest was drenched through, their clothes clinging to their soaked bodies as they fought to keep the ship intact. Their hands were raw from gripping the ropes and sails, and their faces were pale with exhaustion, yet their movements remained sharp and practiced. Years of experience had honed them into a well-coordinated unit, and despite the terror that gnawed at the edges of their resolve, they moved with an almost mechanical precision. Each man knew his role, each woman worked without hesitation, but beneath their stoic exteriors, the fear was palpable. The storm was something none of them had expected to face, and even their seasoned instincts were being tested by its ferocity. The sails, already battered by the fierce winds, strained with each gust, threatening to tear apart at the seams. The crew scrambled to reinforce them, hands reaching out desperately to tie down loose ropes and patch up torn cloth. Water poured from the heavens, drenching them with each crash of the waves. The ship pitched violently, rising and falling with the fury of the ocean, but the crew held their ground, keeping the sails from collapsing entirely. The task was grueling, every movement exhausting, but they pressed on, driven by the unspoken understanding that failure was not an option. The Crimson Tempest was their lifeline, and they would do whatever it took to keep it afloat, even as their bodies screamed for rest. The storm seemed intent on testing every limit of the ship, pushing it to the brink with each massive wave that slammed into the deck. The Crimson Tempest groaned under the strain, its wooden frame creaking as though it might split apart at any moment. The crew fought to maintain control, their legs braced against the slick deck as they worked in unison to secure the rigging and prevent the mast from snapping. Each time a wave crashed over the side, water cascaded across the deck, soaking them to the bone and making the ship even more treacherous. The once sturdy surface became a slick, dangerous battlefield, where every step could send a crew member tumbling into the sea. Yet they did not falter, their focus was singular, survival. As the waves rose higher, crashing over the ship with an almost violent force, the crew began to realize just how close they were to the edge. The Crimson Tempest had weathered many storms before, but this one was unlike any other. The ship seemed to shudder with every strike, its timbers bending and groaning under the weight of the sea's onslaught. For the first time in a long while, doubt crept into their minds. Could the ship survive this? Could they survive this? But even as the storm pressed harder, they refused to give in. With each wave that threatened to swallow them whole, the crew's resolve only strengthened. They were a part of the Crimson Tempest just as much as it was a part of them, and they would not let it fall. The relentless fury of the storm showed no sign of relenting, and yet, the crew of the Crimson Tempest held fast. Though their bodies were weary, their spirits remained unbroken. The rain continued to pour, the wind howled louder, and the waves crashed over them with no end in sight. But still they fought. They fought to keep the sails intact, to keep the rigging secure, to keep the ship from being torn apart by the storm's wrath. Each moment was a battle against exhaustion, against fear, and against the very sea itself. But through it all, they moved together, driven by the knowledge that they were not just a crew, they were a family, and they would endure, no matter the cost. Adrian's grip on the wheel tightened, his hands locked in a vice-like hold as the storm tore at him with unrelenting force. His knuckles, pale and trembling with the strain, stood out starkly against the dark wood of the helm. The ship pitched violently beneath him, and the relentless wind howled in his ears. But Adrian remained still, his focus unshakable. Each turn of the wheel was deliberate, each movement measured with the precision that only years of experience could provide. He had faced countless storms in his life, but this one, with its fury and unpredictability, tested every ounce of his skill. His mind was a battlefield, waging a war against the fear creeping into his thoughts. If he lost control now, if he allowed the tempest to dictate their course, the Crimson Tempest could be lost. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, were fixed on the horizon, where the dark sea met an equally dark sky. Through the furious downpour and flashes of lightning, Adrian could just make out the jagged silhouette of a rocky outcrop, its sharp edges cutting through the storm like the teeth of a monstrous predator. The sight sent a chill through his bones, but there was no time for hesitation. The storm had driven them dangerously close to the rocks, the wind and waves pushing the ship off course with terrifying force. Adrian's mind raced as he assessed the situation. One wrong move, one mistake, and the Crimson Tempest would be dashed against the unforgiving cliffs, its fate sealed in the violent embrace of the sea. The ship lurched again, nearly sending Adrian sprawling, but he held firm, his feet planted wide as he struggled to keep the vessel on its course. The sky above cracked open with another flash of lightning, momentarily blinding him, and in that brief, searing moment of light, the rocky outcrop loomed even closer. His heart hammered in his chest, and every muscle in his body screamed with the effort of holding the wheel steady. The wind seemed to mock him, pushing harder against the sails, trying to tear control from his hands. But Adrian's resolve was ironclad. He had weathered storms more ferocious than this, had outrun naval fleets and battled monstrous seas. This would be no different. He refused to let the sea claim the ship. Not today, not ever. The crew was behind him, working tirelessly to keep the sails intact. But Adrian knew that this battle was his alone to fight. His gaze never wavered from the outcrop as the ship bucked beneath him, sending torrents of water crashing over the deck. The Crimson Tempest groaned, its timbers creaking under the strain of the storm, but it held together, resilient as ever. Adrian's hands were slick with seawater, his grip slipping slightly as the wheel fought against him. Sweat mixed with the rain on his brow, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the outcrop, the jagged rock looming ever closer, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. He couldn't afford to panic, not now. Every decision he made was a matter of life or death. With a final, forceful turn of the wheel, Adrian guided the Crimson Tempest away from the rocks, the ship groaning as it cut through the water. The outcrop passed just out of reach, its sharp silhouette fading into the distance. But Adrian didn't allow himself a moment of relief. The storm was far from over, and they still had a long way to go. But for now, the immediate danger had passed. His chest heaved with a sigh of relief, but he did not relax his grip on the wheel. There would be no rest until they were out of the storm's grasp entirely. And as the Crimson Tempest continued to battle the waves, Adrian's eyes remained locked on the horizon, his mind ever vigilant for the next challenge that awaited them. "Captain?" First Mate Liam's voice cut through the howling wind, strained and filled with panic. Adrian barely heard him at first, the roar of the storm and the crash of the waves deafening everything else. But the urgency in Liam's voice quickly pierced through the chaos, sharpening Adrian's focus. His gaze snapped toward the first mate, who was bracing himself against the railing, his face pale and drawn from exhaustion. Through the torrential rain and the blur of water streaming down his face, Liam's eyes were wide with fear as he pointed toward the horizon, where jagged rocks loomed ominously against the dark sea. The storm had driven them dangerously close to the treacherous outcrop, and Adrian knew that one wrong move could send them straight into the rocks, where death would await them in the form of splintered wood and crushing waves. Adrian's heart skipped a beat as he followed Liam's frantic gesture, his eyes narrowing as the looming rocks became clearer through the mist and rain. The ship lurched violently beneath him, and a sickening feeling of dread curled in his stomach. They were closer than he had realized, the Crimson Tempest drifting toward the jagged outcrop with terrifying speed. The waves seemed to guide them toward it, pulling the ship into a deadly embrace. Adrian's mind raced, calculating their position, the wind's direction, and the ship's momentum. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and in fact, seemed to be intensifying, pushing the Crimson Tempest harder toward the rocks. It was a race against time now. One wrong turn, one slip of the wheel, and they would be shattered against the unforgiving stone. "We need to steer away, now!" Liam shouted again, his voice hoarse and full of desperation. Adrian could see the fear in his first mate's eyes, a fear that was mirrored in the faces of the rest of the crew. The ship groaned under the weight of the storm, its timbers creaking as if it too understood the peril they were in. Adrian's knuckles turned white against the wheel as he fought against the pull of the waves. His mind sharpened with the clarity of experience, but the stakes had never been higher. The ship was at the mercy of the storm, and the rocks were closing in fast. If he failed to act swiftly, it would be the end of them all. With a strained grunt, Adrian jerked the wheel to one side, the Crimson Tempest responding sluggishly as it fought against the onslaught of the sea. The ship veered sharply, tilting at a dangerous angle as the crew scrambled to adjust the sails and prevent it from capsizing. Water surged across the deck, threatening to wash the crew overboard, but Adrian's focus remained unbroken. The ship groaned again, its timbers protesting as the wheel resisted his pull. The rocks loomed dangerously close, their jagged edges like teeth waiting to tear into the vessel's hull. Adrian's muscles burned with the effort of steering against the storm's violent fury, but he refused to let go of the wheel. He had steered the Crimson Tempest through countless perils, and he would not let it end now, not with death so near. As the ship began to turn away from the rocks, the tension in Adrian's chest slowly eased, but the storm was far from over. The Crimson Tempest groaned again, but this time it felt more like a sigh of relief than a death rattle. Liam, standing at his side, exhaled deeply, though the lines of fear had not yet left his face. The ship's angle lessened as it veered clear of the rocks, the jagged outcrop receding in the distance, though still visible in the storm's dark embrace. But Adrian did not allow himself to relax. They were not out of danger yet, and he knew better than to underestimate the power of the storm. The Crimson Tempest had narrowly escaped its rocky doom, but the battle with the sea was far from won. The storm still raged, and Adrian was determined to see his ship and crew through it, no matter the cost. Adrian nodded grimly, his jaw clenched with the weight of the situation. His eyes flicked from the jagged rocks to the dark sky above, his mind already calculating their next move. The storm was a beast, relentless and unforgiving, and the ship had been driven too far off course. The sharp silhouette of the rocks still loomed dangerously close, their jagged edges like teeth waiting to tear into the hull of the Crimson Tempest. His fingers gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles stark against the weathered wood. There was no room for hesitation now. Every decision had to be made in an instant. If they didn't act fast, the ship would be torn to pieces. He turned to Liam, his voice low but firm. I see it. Prepare the lifeboats, just in case. We need to turn hard to port and navigate through this damned storm. Liam's eyes widened at the command, but there was no time for doubt. Without a word, he sprinted toward the crew, barking orders to lower the lifeboats. The crew moved with practiced urgency, their movements swift despite the chaos around them. The rain battered their faces, and the wind howled with an intensity that made it nearly impossible to hear each other. Yet, their training kicked in, and the crew responded as one, working together to ensure that the lifeboats were ready for launch if the worst should happen. Adrian's gaze never left the horizon, watching as the storm surged violently around them. The rocks were too close, and every moment they stayed in the open sea was another moment closer to disaster. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he turned the wheel hard to port, forcing the Crimson Tempest to change direction. The ship groaned under the pressure, its timbers creaking in protest as the sails whipped violently in the gale-force winds. The deck pitched violently beneath his feet, and he had to fight to keep his balance as the ship lurched in response to the sudden turn. The mast shuddered, and the sails strained against the furious wind. Water surged over the deck with every crashing wave, but Adrian's hands remained steady on the wheel. His crew, though exhausted and battered by the storm, trusted him to guide them through it. They had faced countless storms before, but this one was different. The pressure was suffocating, and the threat of disaster was closer than ever. The ship's bow veered sharply to the left, cutting through the churning waters, but the storm had other plans. The waves seemed to rise even higher, crashing down with terrifying force as the wind howled louder, its shrieking voice making it hard to hear anything else. Lightning flashed overhead, momentarily illuminating the chaotic sea, casting eerie shadows across the deck. Adrian's muscles burned with the effort of holding the wheel steady, each turn more difficult than the last. He could feel the ship's resistance, could sense the strain in its bones as it fought to stay afloat. His pulse raced as he looked up at the mast, praying it would hold. They were navigating through the heart of the storm now, and the rocks were still too close. With a final, gritted effort, the Crimson Tempest angled away from the rocks, its bow pointing more directly into the storm's fury. But even as they moved farther from the jagged outcrop, Adrian knew they weren't safe yet. The storm still howled, still battered the ship mercilessly, but now they had a chance. Liam returned to his side, his face pale but determined. "The lifeboats are ready, Captain," he reported. Adrian nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, his mind calculating their next steps. They weren't out of danger, not by a long shot. But for now, they had survived the first wave of the storm's fury, and Adrian would not rest until the Crimson Tempest and her crew were safely beyond its grasp. With a sharp turn of the wheel, Adrian threw his weight into the motion, forcing the Crimson Tempest toward the narrow gap between the rocks. The ship shuddered violently in response, as though it could sense the danger ahead, but Adrian's grip never faltered. His jaw tightened as the wheel spun under his command, the wood of the helm slick with rain and salt water. The howling wind tore at the sails, but Adrian focused on the gap ahead, his only hope for avoiding a fatal collision. His mind raced, calculating their speed, the wind's force, and the distance to the rocks. Every second was a battle against the storm, every movement crucial. The narrow passage between the jagged cliffs loomed like a dark void, a sliver of hope amidst the chaos, but the danger was clear. One wrong move, one slip of the wheel, and they would be crushed. The Crimson Tempest groaned as the ship pitched violently with the force of the waves. The timber creaked and cracked under the pressure, as if the very bones of the vessel were protesting against the fierce onslaught of nature. Adrian could feel it in his bones. The ship was straining, its frame bending with the effort of holding its course. Water surged across the deck, rushing over the edges of the ship with each wave, as the crew fought to keep their footing. The wind screamed through the rigging, and the sails flapped desperately in the gusts, but the ship held its line. Every moment felt like an eternity as the Crimson Tempest fought to remain on course, pushing through the storm's relentless assault. As the ship hurtled closer to the rocks, the path ahead grew clearer for a moment as lightning sliced through the dark sky. In that instant, the jagged teeth of the rocks were illuminated in stark detail, their sharp edges glistening ominously in the brief flash of light. The gap between the cliffs was impossibly narrow, a treacherous tunnel of stone that seemed to offer little hope for survival. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he saw the rocks up ahead, each one threatening to tear the ship apart with a single wrong turn. The flashing lightning cast strange, twisted shadows on the water's surface, making the gap appear even smaller, more suffocating. The Crimson Tempest pressed on, its course set, but Adrian knew the danger they faced. One scrape against those jagged rocks and it could be over. The ship lurched again, and Adrian's grip tightened on the wheel, his muscles aching with the strain of holding the ship steady. He could hear the creak of the timbers, the groaning of the ship's frame as it fought against the storm's fury. The gap was closing fast, and the ship was still too far from the center of it. With another turn of the wheel, Adrian compensated, steering the Crimson Tempest just inches from the jagged rocks. The ship was too close to the rocks now. Its hull was too vulnerable. If they made it through this narrow passage, they would be free, but the risk of disaster was almost unbearable. The crew scrambled to brace themselves against the violent swells of the sea, fear and tension lining their faces. They all knew this was their only chance. Finally, with one last strain of effort, the ship surged forward, slipping through the narrow gap between the rocks. The Crimson Tempest scraped past the stone walls with a heart-stopping groan, the sound of wood scraping against rock ringing through the storm like a death knell. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Adrian held his breath, watching as the ship sailed clear of the rocks, the jagged edges fading into the darkness behind them. A heavy sigh of relief spread through the crew, though none dared to speak yet. The storm raged on, but they had made it. The crimson tempest had survived. Adrian exhaled slowly, his hands still steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the sea ahead. There was still much more to face, but for now, they had won this battle. The crew moved with an intensity that could only come from years of experience, their bodies fluid and synchronized as they worked under the unrelenting assault of the storm. The wind howled like a maddened beast, tearing through the rigging and whipping the sails into chaotic disarray. But despite the fury of the storm, each crew member moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their actions dictated by instinct and long hours spent on the sea. They adjusted the sails, pulling them tighter against the wind, fighting to maintain control of the crimson tempest as it was tossed and bucked by the violent waves. Every movement was swift, deliberate, and born from countless battles with the sea. The crew was a team forged through adversity, each man knowing exactly what needed to be done, often without needing to speak a word. In the midst of the chaos, the rhythmic sound of the pumps working tirelessly against the rising water echoed across the deck. The crew manned them with determined focus, their muscles straining as they worked in tandem to keep the ship afloat. Waves crashed over the sides, soaking them through, but they pushed on, their hands steady and unyielding. There was no time for fear or hesitation. The rising water threatened to swallow them whole if they faltered for even a moment. As the ship groaned and creaked beneath the pressure of the storm, the crew knew they had to outlast the chaos, to fight back the sea and hold on until the storm's rage had spent itself. Their hearts beat in unison, a collective rhythm that spoke of their shared purpose, survival. Despite the torrents of rain and the whipping wind, the crew held on to anything they could find to keep their footing. The deck was slick with seawater, treacherous with every step, and yet they moved with purpose, never wavering in their resolve. Some clung to the ropes, their hands raw from the constant strain, while others gripped the railings or whatever solid surface was nearby. The ship lurched again, and the crew braced themselves, their legs wide to absorb the shock as the crimson tempest was tossed from side to side. The rain stemmed their faces, but it was a pain they had grown used to over the years. Each man knew that their survival depended on holding fast, both physically to the ship and mentally to each other. In the midst of the storm's fury, there was an unspoken understanding that echoed among the crew, a bond forged by the trials of the sea. They were a family, bound not by blood, but by the shared knowledge that in moments like this, their survival depended entirely on their unity and determination. The captain's commands were clear, and the crew followed them without question, knowing that each action, no matter how small, contributed to the greater effort. Their faces were etched with fatigue, their bodies weary from the strain of the storm, but their eyes were sharp, filled with a resolve that no wave or gust of wind could extinguish. They fought together, not as individuals, but as a single force, each man knowing his role, trusting his shipmates with his life. The storm roared on, but the crew's determination did not waver. Their unity was their strength, and together they battled the raging sea, the ship their only lifeline in the chaos. The wind continued to scream through the rigging, the waves crashed relentlessly against the hull, and the rain lashed down in torrents, but there was no fear in their movements. They had faced storms before, but this one was different. It was a test, a trial of their endurance and their will. And as the crimson tempest groaned beneath the force of the storm, the crew held on, their hearts in sync, their bodies working as one to keep the ship afloat. They would survive this, together, or they would perish as a single unit. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a deafening thud that echoed through the chaos around him. The crimson tempest lurched violently as it threaded through the narrow gap between the rocks, the hull creaking under the tremendous strain. The jagged teeth of the cliffs seemed to close in around them, their dark, unforgiving silhouettes looming so close that Adrian could almost feel their cold, ancient presence, as if the rocks themselves were determined to claim the ship. The ship groaned as it fought the surging waves, and for a moment, it felt as if they would be torn apart by the sheer force of nature. But Adrian's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white against the wood. His body tensed, every muscle screaming in resistance. But his mind remained calm, focused solely on the task at hand. Sweat mingled with the rain that lashed at his face, stinging his skin as the wind howled around him. His clothes were soaked through, heavy and clinging to his frame, but he refused to let it distract him. His eyes remained fixed on the path ahead, every fiber of his being concentrated on steering the ship through the treacherous gap. The sound of the storm was deafening, the wind and waves roaring like a beast trying to consume them. Yet through it all, Adrian's resolve never wavered. He had weathered countless storms, had faced dangers far worse than this, and he would not let fear take hold now. The Crimson Tempest might have been battered, but it was far from broken. And as long as he commanded her, she would sail through the storm, no matter how fierce. His thoughts were a blur of calculations and instincts, but one thing stood out amidst the chaos: the distant, faint glow of a lighthouse. It was small, barely visible through the storm, but to Adrian, it was a beacon of hope. The lighthouse was their guiding light, an indication of calmer waters just beyond the storm's fury. It was a symbol of the safety they had been desperately fighting for, a promise that the madness of the storm would eventually end. His gaze locked onto that distant glow, the single point of light that seemed to pierce through the darkness and the rain. It was the only thing that mattered now, and with every passing moment, Adrian steered the Crimson Tempest closer to it, his heart sinking with the rhythm of the ship. The ship groaned again, its timbers straining as it fought against the waves, but Adrian's grip on the wheel remained firm, unyielding. He could feel the tension in the ship, the way the wood seemed to shudder with every crash of the waves. The storm had torn at them, battered them, and yet they pressed on, inching closer to the gap. The rocks were so close now that Adrian could almost hear the scrape of the ship's hull against the sharp edges, but he never wavered. His eyes never left the lighthouse. It was all that mattered now. The gap was narrowing, the storm's fury relentless, but Adrian knew they could make it. He could feel it in his bones. They were so close, just a few more seconds, a few more careful maneuvers, and they would be free. Finally, with a final, breath-stealing surge, the ship lurched one last time, slipping through the gap between the rocks. The roar of the storm didn't fade, not immediately, but the ship was now past the worst of it. Adrian allowed himself a brief, silent exhale as he steered the Crimson Tempest away from the jagged rocks, his eyes still fixed on the lighthouse. The calm waters it promised were so close now, just beyond the storm's reach. The ship had made it through, but Adrian knew the journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, but for now, the storm's grip had loosened. The lighthouse, like a steadfast guardian, stood in the distance, and Adrian knew that as long as they sailed toward it, they would find the calm they so desperately sought. "Steady as she goes!" Adrian's voice rang out, clear and commanding, cutting through the howling winds and crashing waves. The storm's fury still gripped the Crimson Tempest, but Adrian's tone left no room for doubt or hesitation. His words were a rallying cry, a final push toward the calm that lay just beyond the chaos. Every syllable seemed to solidify the bond between the captain and his crew, a silent pact that they would endure together, no matter what. His eyes remained fixed on the distant lighthouse, the single point of light that now seemed like a tangible goal, a promise of safety after the madness they had weathered. He could feel the ship's rhythm beneath him, the tension in the wood as it fought against the waves, but there was no turning back now. The crew responded with a renewed sense of urgency, their movements sharp and synchronized despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on their bodies. Some adjusted the sails, pulling them tighter against the wind, while others gripped the rigging with white-knuckled hands, bracing for whatever the storm still had in store. The deck was slick with seawater, but the crew knew they had only moments to push through. They could hear Adrian's command echo through the storm, a signal that they were on the verge of something more than survival. They were on the cusp of victory. The storm had tested their strength, but they had not wavered. They had fought together, and now they could almost taste the sweet relief of the calm waters ahead. Adrian's hands remained steady on the wheel, his knuckles a stark contrast to the dark wood beneath him, as the ship lurched with each powerful wave. He could feel the creak of the timbers beneath him, the groan of the ship as it fought the relentless pounding of the sea. But through it all, His mind was sharp, focused solely on the path ahead. His voice carried with the authority of a captain who knew the weight of leadership in times of crisis. "We're almost there," he shouted again, the words leaving his lips with the finality of someone who had already charted their course to safety. There was no room for doubt. The lighthouse was within their reach, and that was all that mattered. The wind howled in protest, whipping Adrian's coat around his legs as the ship fought to maintain its course. But his resolve was unwavering. He knew that they had pushed past the worst of the storm, that the worst of nature's wrath was behind them. The crew, though drenched and battered, could feel the same shift in the air. The constant pressure of the waves against the ship had lessened, the winds were not as vicious, and the roar of the ocean was no longer as all-encompassing. In the distance, the faint glow of the lighthouse seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment, its light a beacon of hope piercing through the storm's darkened veil. Adrian's eyes remained locked on it, his entire focus on reaching it, guiding his crew through the final stretch. With each turn of the wheel, Adrian guided the Crimson Tempest closer to its salvation. The ship responded as if it too could feel the proximity of calm, its frame no longer groaning under the strain of the storm. The crew, still working in perfect synchrony, began to show signs of relief, their exhausted faces lifting as they realized the worst was behind them. But Adrian kept his gaze fixed forward, his hands steady on the wheel. They weren't out of danger yet, not entirely, but he knew the worst was over. The storm had tested them, but they had stood firm, and now the calm awaited. "Steady as she goes," he repeated, the words no longer just a command but a declaration that they had won this fight together. As the Crimson Tempest finally broke free from the storm's relentless grip, a wave of calm seemed to wash over the ship. The violent rocking and jarring lurches that had defined the past hours slowly began to subside, replaced by the gentler swells of the open sea. The howling winds that had once torn through the rigging now softened into a mournful whisper, the rain tapering off to a light drizzle. The ship no longer groaned under the strain of the tempest's fury. Instead, it moved with a steady rhythm, as though it too recognized the shift in the storm's hold. Adrian, who had remained locked in a battle of wills with the sea, allowed himself a moment to relax, his grip on the wheel loosening just slightly. They had made it through. The worst was over. The crew, battered and drenched, looked around as the intensity of the weather began to wane. The sounds of the storm, once deafening and all-consuming, faded into a quiet murmur, the chaotic thrashing of the waves now nothing more than a rolling lull. Each member of the crew stood a little taller, their shoulders less tense, as though the tension that had gripped them for hours was finally beginning to ease. The deck, still slick with seawater, felt less treacherous beneath their feet. They exchanged glances of relief, some even allowing themselves brief, exhausted smiles. There was no need for words. The collective feeling of survival, of having weathered the storm together, spoke volumes. They had made it through. Off in the distance, the faint but steady glow of the lighthouse beacon pierced the darkness, its light cutting through the fading remnants of the storm. It shone like a guiding star, unwavering and resolute, offering them a safe haven after the chaos. The crew's eyes turned toward it in unison, the sight of its steady light igniting a sense of hope that was palpable in the air. It wasn't just a symbol of safety, it was the promise of something more, a future beyond the storm, a chance to catch their breath, to regroup, and to move forward. Adrian's eyes locked onto the lighthouse, his face softening with the relief that only a seasoned captain could feel after guiding his crew through such a trial. With every passing moment, the Crimson Tempest seemed to glide more smoothly through the waves, the violent rocking replaced by the gentle lapping of the ocean against the hull. The crew, though exhausted, were able to focus on the task of making sure the ship was in order, securing loose ropes and adjusting the sails for the calmer waters ahead. The storm's wrath had left its mark, but now there was a calm that spread across the deck, a brief reprieve from nature's ferocity. The sound of the waves was no longer an intimidating roar but a steady rhythm, soothing after the madness they had endured. The storm, once a beast that seemed invincible, had faded into the background, a distant memory as the horizon grew clearer. As the ship moved closer to the lighthouse, the sense of unity among the crew strengthened. The storm had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but they had faced it together, with unwavering determination. Now, as the waves settled into a less tumultuous rhythm, the Crimson Tempest sailed smoothly towards safer waters, her crew's collective sigh of relief mingling with the gentle roll of the sea. Adrian remained at the wheel, his grip now relaxed, but his eyes never straying far from the beacon ahead. It was a symbol of the journey's end, of triumph over nature's fury, and a promise that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together, as one. The storm was behind them, and ahead lay a horizon full of new possibilities. Exhausted but triumphant, Adrian stood at the helm of the Crimson Tempest, his eyes scanning the ship in the aftermath of the storm. The battered vessel rocked gently now, her frame still sturdy despite the brutal assault she had endured. The once pristine sails were torn and shredded in places, the ropes and rigging a tangled mess from the relentless winds. The deck, slick with seawater, bore the marks of the storm's wrath. Debris scattered across the planks and a few broken barrels left in the wake of the tempest's rage. But despite the damage, the ship had held together, her heart still beating strong beneath the chaos. Adrian's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the storm clouds were slowly parting, giving way to the promise of calmer skies. He felt a surge of pride. They had made it. As his eyes returned to his crew, Adrian could see the toll the storm had taken on them. They were soaked to the bone, their faces drawn with exhaustion, and some still stumbled on unsteady feet, the physical and mental strain weighing heavily on them. Yet, despite the toll, there was a certain resilience in their posture, an unwavering strength that could only come from having survived such a trial together. They were a family, each one as battered as the ship, but none of them had given up. They had fought the storm, had battled the sea with everything they had, and now they were here, alive, with the storm behind them. Adrian felt a surge of gratitude for each and every one of them. Adrian's eyes met those of his men, his heart swelling with pride. They had stood by him through the worst of it, weathering the storm as one. In their eyes, he saw the same mixture of exhaustion and determination that he felt in his own chest. Their faces were streaked with salt water and sweat, but their expressions held no fear, no doubt. They had done what no one else could, survived the fury of the storm and emerged from it stronger for it. And in that moment, Adrian knew that this crew, his crew, would follow him to the ends of the earth. There was no force that could break them, no storm too fierce to deter them. He felt the weight of his responsibility to them, and yet, in that moment, it felt like the greatest honor of his life. A weary smile spread across Adrian's face as he surveyed the men around him. It wasn't a smile of relief, not entirely, but one of respect and acknowledgement. They had earned it, every single one of them. The storm had tested them, had pushed them to the very edge, and yet they had prevailed. Adrian's hands, still gripping the wheel, relaxed slightly as the tension that had coiled in his muscles began to ease. They were out of danger now. The worst had passed, and the crew had proven their mettle. They were more than just a team. They were a family bound by their shared experiences, by the blood and salt water that had soaked their clothes and stained their souls. As the Crimson Tempest sailed steadily toward calmer waters, the crew began to move with renewed purpose. They knew there was still work to be done, repairs to be made, sails to be tended to, and supplies to be checked, but for now, there was a brief, hard-earned reprieve. Adrian turned away from the wheel, his steps slow and deliberate as he made his way toward the crew. He clapped a hand on the shoulder of the nearest sailor, a gesture of solidarity, of pride. His voice was low, hoarse from hours of shouting over the storm's roar, but it carried the weight of his respect. "Well done," he said simply. His men, weary but with spirits lifted, nodded in return, their gratitude unspoken but clearly understood. They had survived the storm. And with Adrian leading them, they knew they could survive whatever came next. "Well done, lads," Adrian said, his voice rough but filled with pride as he clapped Liam firmly on the shoulder. The first mate met his gaze with a tired but grateful nod, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The storm had taken its toll on everyone, but they had made it through together. For a moment, there was a brief silence as they both took in the quiet that had replaced the storm's fury. The wind was still fresh, carrying the briny scent of the sea, but the violent crashing of waves had lessened, leaving only the sound of gentle lapping against the hull. It was a small victory, one that had come at great cost, but it was theirs. The Crimson Tempest had weathered the worst of it, and so had they. Adrian's eyes swept across the deck, noting the exhaustion etched on each face, the bruises and cuts from the storm's brutality. But despite their weariness, there was a sense of resolve in every sailor's posture. They stood straighter now, their shoulders squared, and the storm's grip on their spirits seemed to loosen with each passing minute. But Adrian knew better than to let their guard down completely. The sea was a fickle mistress, one who could turn on them with little warning, and the challenges they had faced in the storm were far from the only dangers they would encounter on their journey. He could already feel the weight of what lay ahead pressing on his chest, but for now, he allowed himself a moment to appreciate the hard-earned triumph. "We've made it through this storm," Adrian continued, his voice carrying across the deck, drawing the crew's attention. He paused, letting the words sink in. The storm had been fierce, unrelenting, but they had prevailed. They had stuck together, fought with every ounce of strength they had, and now they could claim victory over it. Adrian's gaze hardened, his brow furrowing as he glanced at the damage the storm had inflicted on the ship. The sails were in tatters, the rigging a mess, and parts of the deck were still slick with seawater, but it was nothing they couldn't fix. The Crimson Tempest was a sturdy ship, built to endure the harshest of conditions, and she would continue to do so. But they needed to act quickly. Adrian took a deep breath, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but his mind sharp and focused. "But we've got many more challenges ahead," he said, his tone more serious now. The crew's eyes shifted from him to the horizon, where the sky was clearing and the promise of calmer seas beckoned. Yet, in the back of his mind, Adrian knew the ocean could never be trusted. There were always dangers lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to strike. He glanced back at the ship's battered condition, the damage to the sails and rigging, and the wear on the crew. The Crimson Tempest needed repairs, and fast. There was no time to waste. They needed to be ready for whatever the sea might throw at them next. "Let's make sure the Crimson Tempest is ready for whatever comes next," Adrian said, his voice steady and firm. He turned toward Liam and the rest of the crew, his eyes hard with determination. They may have survived this storm, but the pirate captain knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges that tested their endurance, their unity, and their resolve. Every sailor on this ship had proven themselves in the storm, but they couldn't afford to be complacent. Adrian gave a quick nod, signaling that the work needed to begin immediately. With the crew's collective effort, they would repair the ship, restore their strength, and prepare for whatever dangers lay ahead. Their survival depended on it, and Adrian wouldn't let them fail. As the crew scattered across the deck to begin repairs, their movements were purposeful, driven by a shared understanding that their work wasn't just about fixing the Crimson Tempest, it was about restoring themselves, too. The torn sails were being carefully gathered and stowed, ready to be mended, while others worked to secure the rigging that had been torn asunder by the storm's fury. The ship, though battered, was still a symbol of their strength and unity. Adrian watched them for a moment, noting the way the crew members supported one another, lifting each other's spirits even as their bodies ached from the strain. The storm had pushed them to their limits, but in its wake, it had forged an even stronger connection among them. Adrian's eyes, however, were drawn to the horizon, where the sea stretched out in a peaceful, serene expanse. The chaotic waves that had threatened to swallow them whole were gone, replaced by the soft roll of the water, the calm that followed the storm. He could still feel the lingering tension in his chest from the battle with the tempest, the adrenaline that had kept him sharp, but it was slowly fading. The Crimson Tempest was no longer at the mercy of the storm. The crew's efforts, their unity, and their unspoken bond had carried them through the worst of it. As he stood there, hands resting on the ship's wheel, the faint salt in the air mixed with the fresh promise of calmer days ahead. The storm had tested the crew's mettle in ways few could understand. Its savage winds and crushing waves had threatened to tear them apart, but it had instead brought them closer. Adrian knew the true strength of a crew was tested not in the smooth, easy times, but in the hardest of storms. The men and women who sailed with him had proven themselves worthy of the Crimson Tempest's legacy. Adrian had seen fear in their eyes, yes, but he had also seen the unwavering resolve that followed it. They had not faltered, not once, and now that the storm had passed, that same strength remained. They had weathered the fury of nature, and in doing so, they had solidified their bond. It was a bond forged not just in hardship but in mutual respect and trust. Adrian's gaze lingered on the peaceful sea, knowing that this calm would not last forever. The high seas were never truly still, never truly safe. There would be more challenges, more dangers, more storms to face. But the thought didn't daunt him, it emboldened him. The adventure that awaited them was filled with the unknown, with mystery and danger, but it was a journey he would take with his crew, with the men and women who had earned his respect and loyalty. The sea was a vast, untamed world, but it was theirs to navigate. And with each passing moment, Adrian felt his heart swell with anticipation, ready for the challenges that lay ahead. With the storm behind them and the ship slowly returning to its normal rhythm, Captain Adrian Blackwood stood taller, his resolve steeled by the trials of the tempest. The crew continued their work with a renewed sense of purpose, their spirits high despite the physical toll they had endured. Adrian knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but as he looked at his crew, his family, he was filled with confidence. The storm had been a test, but now, with the Crimson Tempest restored and the crew ready, the adventure of the high seas awaited them. Whatever the future held, Captain Adrian Blackwood and his crew would face it together, with the unwavering bond that had been forged in the heart of the storm. Chapter 2: The Magical Reef. The storm had passed, its fury spent, and now the Crimson Tempest drifted gently in calmer waters. The ship's battered frame creaked softly in the stillness, as though sighing in relief after the violent clash with nature. The crew, exhausted and soaked to the bone, moved with quiet efficiency. Their faces were drawn, but there was a visible shift in their demeanor, a quiet pride in their survival, a determination to restore the ship and themselves. The fierce winds had died, leaving only a light breeze to fill the sails, and the crew worked with a renewed sense of purpose. There was no need for words now. The actions of each sailor spoke volumes. They had faced the storm together, and had come out on the other side, ready to rebuild. As the crew mended the sails and secured the rigging, Adrian stood at the helm, his eyes turned toward the horizon. The storm had left its mark, but it had also strengthened the bond among his men and women. The sight of the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds brought a sense of relief, a symbolic end to the chaos. The orange and pink hues of the sunrise bathed the ship in a soft glow, casting a serene light on the weary faces of the crew. The tumultuous night was gone, and in its place was the promise of a new day, one that felt almost like a gift after the terror they had faced. Adrian's chest swelled with a quiet sense of pride as he watched his crew move with steady hands, determined to set things right. The sea, once a roaring beast, had transformed into a tranquil expanse of sapphire blue. The waves were gentle now, rolling lazily beneath the ship as the morning light danced across their surface. The Crimson Tempest rocked slowly, no longer at the mercy of the storm, but at the mercy of the calm. The silence that hung in the air was almost surreal after the deafening roar of the tempest. In every direction, the ocean stretched out endlessly, a peaceful expanse that seemed to welcome them after the battle. It was a vast emptiness, but one that held potential, and the crew felt it. This was the sea they knew, the sea they had chosen to sail. The storm had passed, but the adventure was far from over. Adrian took a deep breath, savoring the freshness of the air and the sight of his crew working with a shared sense of purpose. The worst was behind them, but there was still much to do. The ship needed repairs, and the crew needed rest. But as the sun climbed higher, casting its warmth over the deck, Adrian felt a sense of hope. The storm had tested them, yes, but it had also shown him what his crew was made of. They had faced the worst of the sea together, and now, as the waters calmed, they were ready for whatever came next. The Crimson Tempest had weathered the storm, and so had they. The horizon was open, the journey ahead filled with possibilities. Captain Adrian Blackwood stood at the bow, his hands resting lightly on the railing as he scanned the vast expanse of the horizon. The sea, now calm and endless, stretched before him, a canvas of deep blue broken only by the occasional ripple of a passing breeze. The sun, climbing higher with each passing moment, bathed the ship in a warm, golden light, the rays reflecting off the water in shimmering waves. Adrian's eyes, sharp and unwavering, took in every detail of the sea, his mind constantly alert, always searching for signs of opportunity, danger, or something else entirely. His seasoned instincts had never let him down, and today, they pricked at the back of his mind, urging him to look closer. As the sun continued its ascent, casting long shadows across the deck, something caught Adrian's eye, a flash of iridescence beneath the water's surface. At first, it was just a glimmer, a fleeting glimpse of light that seemed out of place in the tranquil sea. But as the light grew more intense, Adrian's gaze sharpened, his focus honing in on the mysterious shimmer. It was an unnatural gleam, almost as if the water itself was hiding something beneath. His heart skipped a beat, and a wave of curiosity washed over him. There were few things that could hide beneath the surface of the sea without leaving a trace, and Adrian had learned long ago that the sea was full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. His eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, trying to make sense of the sight before him. The shimmer seemed to move, dancing in the shallows, as though it was alive. The water itself appeared to bend and twist around it, as if something otherworldly was at play beneath the surface. Adrian's brow furrowed in concentration. He had sailed these waters countless times, yet he had never encountered anything quite like this. His mind raced, considering all the possibilities: treasure, a sea creature, or perhaps even something more elusive, a hidden mystery waiting to be discovered. Whatever it was not something to be ignored. He couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward it, a magnetic force that urged him to investigate further. "Liam!" Adrian called without taking his eyes off the shimmering light below. His first mate, a sharp-eyed sailor who had worked alongside Adrian for years, was quick to respond, stepping up beside him. "Do you see that?" Adrian asked, his voice low and filled with both intrigue and caution. Liam squinted toward the shimmering surface, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the same unusual gleam. "Aye, Captain. It's not natural, that's for sure." The two men exchanged a glance, the unspoken understanding passing between them. Whatever lay beneath those waters, it was not something they could simply sail past. With a command to change course, Adrian's crew sprang into action, preparing for whatever mystery the sea was about to reveal. The adventure, it seemed, was only just beginning. "Liam, come here," Adrian called, his voice low but filled with an edge of curiosity. His eyes remained fixed on the glimmer beneath the surface, his mind working over the possibilities. The sea, so vast and unpredictable, had revealed many secrets in its time, but this shimmer was different. It seemed almost deliberate, as though something was trying to get their attention. The golden light of the sun bathed the water in a soft glow, but beneath it, that shimmer pulsed with an iridescence that felt out of place, unnatural. Adrian's instincts were on high alert, and he knew that whatever lay beneath the waves could be something extraordinary, or something dangerous. Liam, who had been busy overseeing the crew's work, immediately looked up at the sound of his captain's voice. He knew that tone all too well. There was no hesitation in his step as he moved quickly to Adrian's side. As he joined the captain at the bow, Liam followed Adrian's gaze, his eyes scanning the waters intently. The shimmer was still there, just beneath the surface, twisting and dancing with the movement of the waves. "What do you see, Captain?" Liam asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. He trusted Adrian's judgment implicitly and knew when something warranted further attention. This was one of those moments. Adrian didn't take his eyes off the mysterious gleam as he spoke. "There," he said, pointing at the water, his finger steady. "Do you see it? It's like the lights, moving with a purpose." He furrowed his brow as he tried to make sense of the sight. It wasn't simply the reflection of the sun on the water. It was something more, something beneath the surface, just beyond reach. "I've sailed these waters for years, Liam, and I've never seen anything like this before. It's not natural." The hairs on the back of Adrian's neck prickled. Something about the shimmer stirred an instinctive unease in him, though he couldn't yet place why. Whatever it wasn't a typical reflection or fish. No, this was something else entirely. Liam squinted, narrowing his eyes as he studied the water. Aye, Captain, I see it now. Looks like it's moving in and out of the shallows, almost like it's guiding us, he said, his voice low with a sense of realization. The unease in Adrian's gut grew stronger as the idea formed. Was it possible that something, or someone, was deliberately leading them? Was it a trap or an opportunity? The unknown lay before them, tempting them to dive deeper into the mystery. Adrian turned to Liam, his expression resolute. Prepare the crew, Liam. We're changing course. Let's see where this leads. There was no turning back now. The sea had thrown them a challenge, and Adrian Blackwood was always ready to meet it head-on. First mate Liam approached, his boots tapping softly against the wooden deck as he moved toward Adrian. He squinted against the glare of the sun, trying to focus on the glimmering sight just beneath the surface of the water. The waves lapped gently at the hull of the Crimson Tempest, but Liam's attention was entirely consumed by the strange phenomenon. It wasn't the normal pattern of sunlight reflecting off the sea, nor the play of shadows from passing clouds. This shimmer seemed deliberate, almost as if it were beckoning them. His seasoned eyes, trained on countless strange sights during their voyages, couldn't quite place what it was, and that uncertainty stirred a gnawing feeling in his gut. He stepped closer to Adrian, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What's that, Captain?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Adrian didn't shift his gaze from the shimmering light. His eyes narrowed in concentration. The mystery beneath the water tugged at him, drawing him in like a siren's call. "I don't know yet, Liam," he said, his voice steady but filled with intrigue. He could feel the pull of the unknown, that familiar excitement mixed with the trepidation of venturing into uncharted territory. He had sailed these waters countless times, yet he had never encountered something like this. The shimmer didn't resemble any fish or marine life he knew of, and it was certainly no mere reflection. The way it flickered and moved felt almost alive. His instincts, honed from years at sea, told him there was something far more significant lurking just beneath the surface. Liam's eyes followed the captain's finger, pointing toward the strange glow that seemed to shift with the currents. He leaned over the edge of the ship, trying to see deeper into the water, but it was too murky to make out anything clearly. The sun's rays, despite their brilliance, seemed unable to cut through the depths where the light emanated from. "It doesn't look like any fish or treasure I've seen before," Liam muttered, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. His mind raced through possibilities, but nothing seemed to fit. He turned back to Adrian, sensing that his captain was already contemplating a course of action. "Do you think it's some kind of trap? Or maybe a signal?" Adrian's gaze remained fixed on the water, his mind swirling with possibilities. He had never believed in superstition, but there was something unnerving about the way the shimmer danced beneath the waves, like it was inviting them into deeper waters, promising something just out of reach. Adrian turned to Liam, his expression a mixture of resolve and caution. "Prepare the crew," he said, his voice decisive. "We're not going to ignore this. We'll approach slowly, keep our wits about us, and see where it leads. Whatever it is, it's not by accident. We're going after it, but we'll be ready for anything." With a final glance at the mysterious shimmer, Adrian turned and strode to the helm, his mind set on the course ahead. The adventure had taken a turn, and he intended to see it through, no matter the risk. Adrian shook his head slowly, disbelief mingling with amusement as he gazed at the shimmering sight beneath the water. A grin began to spread across his face, the kind of grin that only came when a new mystery, an adventure, beckoned. He had sailed through storms, battled rival pirates, and uncovered treasures in the most unlikely places, but nothing had quite caught his attention like this. His usual confidence was tinged with an eagerness that hadn't surfaced in years. "I've never seen anything like it," he said, his voice carrying a mix of wonder and excitement. The shimmer, still moving in that strange, purposeful way, held his gaze, pulling him deeper into the unknown. It wasn't a threat, not yet anyway, but it was something that demanded attention. His first mate, Liam, stood by his side, eyes still narrowed in confusion, but Adrian's grin was contagious. Liam had seen his captain confront many strange situations, but this one was different. There was a fire in Adrian's eyes that Liam hadn't seen in some time, a spark that had always driven their most daring escapades. "Looks like something worth investigating," Adrian added, more to himself than to Liam, but the words carried an unspoken invitation. The captain's curiosity had been piqued, and once that happened, there was no turning back. Whatever lay beneath the shimmering surface, it had managed to capture the interest of a man who had seen it all. Liam exchanged a quick glance with Adrian, his lips tightening into a knowing smile. "Aye, Captain. Looks like we've got ourselves another mystery," he said, his voice low but filled with the same sense of intrigue that Adrian had ignited in him. It wasn't just the sea they sailed upon. It was a world full of secrets, and they were often the first to uncover them. Liam could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The ship had been calm for only moments, but now, with Adrian's resolve firm and his curiosity sparked, it was as if the entire crew felt the change. The adventure had taken a new direction, and they would follow their captain wherever it led. Adrian turned toward the crew, his grin widening as he shouted over to them. "All hands, prepare to change course. We've got something to chase." The crew, quick to respond to their captain's orders, sprang into action. The ship's course began to shift, moving toward the glimmering mystery just beneath the water's surface. Adrian's mind raced with possibilities, treasure, ancient relics, or even a hidden danger, but his excitement outweighed his caution. For Adrian Blackwood, the unknown was always a thrill, and this mystery was no different. With the wind now at their backs, the Crimson Tempest moved forward, cutting through the water, toward whatever secrets the sea was hiding. The crew, weary from their relentless repairs and longing for a moment of respite, eagerly gathered around the deck as Adrian steered the Crimson Tempest toward the shimmering reef. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, the tension from the storm still lingering but slowly dissipating as the crew focused on the new discovery ahead. The men and women stood shoulder to shoulder, all eyes fixed on the sight before them, curiosity and wonder taking hold of them. They had faced the fury of nature, but now they found themselves drawn to something far more mysterious, something that promised both beauty and danger in equal measure. Adrian, his hands steady on the wheel, shared their anticipation, his gaze locked on the shifting waters ahead. As the ship drew closer, the calm surface of the sea seemed to change before their eyes. The water beneath them was no longer the deep blue they were accustomed to. It had transformed into a mesmerizing kaleidoscope of colors. Every ripple, every subtle movement of the ship created a new pattern, as if the sea itself were alive with energy. Radiant blues blended seamlessly into soft purples, while vibrant greens and turquoise swirled together, as though painted by an unseen hand. The colors shifted and flowed with the waves, creating a hypnotic effect that held the crew's attention in a spell. It was as if they had stumbled upon a hidden world, a secret beneath the surface that only those brave enough to sail these waters could witness. The beauty of the reef was undeniable. Even the most hardened sailors, who had seen countless wonders over the years, stood in stunned silence, their mouths agape as they marveled at the magical display unfolding before them. The colors beneath the water seemed to pulse with life, flickering like the light of distant stars or the glow of 1,000 fireflies. There was a sense of otherworldliness to the scene, as though they had entered a realm untouched by time. The reef's magic was palpable, a force that seemed to reach up from the depths, calling them to venture closer. It wasn't just the beauty of the display that captivated them, it was the feeling that something extraordinary awaited just below the surface. Adrian, sensing the awe that had gripped his crew, allowed the ship to drift slowly closer, his eyes narrowing as he observed the shifting colors. His heart quickened, not just from the wonder of the sight but from the growing suspicion that this was no ordinary reef. There was something deliberate about the way the colors shifted, something intentional in the way the sea seemed to guide them forward. The captain's instincts, ever sharp, told him that the magic of the reef was more than just a visual spectacle. It was a clue, an invitation to something hidden beneath the waves. As the ship glided closer, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. Whatever secrets lay within this kaleidoscopic reef, Adrian Blackwood was ready to uncover them. The Crimson Tempest anchored just off the coast of the shimmering reef, its sails flapping softly in the wind as the crew prepared to explore this newfound mystery. Adrian stood at the bow, watching as a few brave crew members worked swiftly to lower a small boat into the water. The men moved with practiced precision, their faces set with a mixture of excitement and caution. Adrian felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was something about this place that pulled at him, something he couldn't yet explain. With a determined nod to his crew, he motioned for them to gather. "Let's see what this reef has to offer," he said, his voice carrying over the stillness of the sea. He climbed into the boat with ease, flanked by Liam and a few others, their faces reflecting the same sense of adventure. As the small boat drifted away from the ship, the air around them grew heavier with anticipation. The crew rowed with quiet determination, the rhythmic dip of the oars into the water breaking the silence. The calm sea beneath them seemed to vibrate with energy, as if the very water itself was alive. Adrian's eyes remained fixed ahead, where the reef's colors continued to dance in the depths. The closer they drew, the more the water began to shimmer with a strange, otherworldly glow. The once peaceful surface of the sea had taken on a new quality, as though it were part of something much greater and more mysterious. With each stroke, the boat drew nearer to the heart of the reef, the sense of magic growing stronger. As they reached the outer edge of the reef, the enchantments became even more pronounced. The water was now alive with movement, revealing strange bioluminescent creatures flitting in and out of view. Their soft, glowing bodies cast eerie, ethereal trails of light through the water, illuminating the depths with an otherworldly glow. The creatures seemed to be both part of the reef and its guardians, darting around with purposeful intent. Some resembled jellyfish, their translucent forms pulsing with blue and green light, while others were more abstract, shapes that seemed to change with every blink of the eye. The air around the boat felt charged, as if the very essence of the reef was reaching out to them, drawing them closer into its depths. The crew's faces were filled with awe as they watched the spectacle unfold beneath the water's surface. Even Liam, ever the pragmatic first mate, was silent, his gaze fixed on the strange creatures that seemed to welcome their presence. Adrian, too, was transfixed, his heart racing with the thrill of discovery. He could feel the weight of the reef's secrets pressing in on him, as if it were trying to communicate something ancient and profound. The shimmering light, the creatures, the pulse of energy in the water, it was all connected, and Adrian could sense that they were on the brink of uncovering something far beyond their expectations. "Keep your wits about you," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the quiet lapping of the water. Whatever this reef held, it was more than just magic. It was a key to something larger, something that would change everything. Adrian's eyes widened as he leaned forward in the boat, his gaze fixed on the reef below. The water had cleared, revealing an astonishing sight, intricate patterns etched into the coral formations. The symbols, unlike anything he had seen before, seemed to dance across the stone like living carvings. They pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow, as though they were alive with energy, responding to the movements of the boat above them. The symbols shifted subtly, their forms changing and evolving, as if they held secrets that only the most attuned could decipher. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. He knew at once that the reef was more than just a natural wonder. It was a relic, an artifact of something ancient and powerful, waiting to be uncovered. As the boat drifted closer, the patterns became even more distinct, glowing brighter as if drawing them in. The runes etched into the coral glimmered with a kind of intelligence, their meanings long forgotten by the world above the surface. The air around them grew heavier with a sense of mystery and reverence. It was as though the very ocean was holding its breath, watching them, waiting. Adrian could feel the pull of the symbols, as though they were calling to him, urging him to understand their meaning. His fingers itched to reach out and touch the coral, but he knew better than to act without caution. The reef was not simply a piece of the sea. It was a living testament to forgotten magic, something that could hold both knowledge and peril in equal measure. The more Adrian studied the reef, the more he realized that the patterns weren't just random designs. They were deliberate, each one connected to the others in a vast web of meaning. His mind raced with the possibilities, ancient civilizations, lost magics, or even a forgotten history of the seas. The reef was like a map, a guide to something greater hidden beneath the waves, its magic alive and dormant for centuries. It was clear now that this was no ordinary reef. It was a repository of something far beyond the natural world. Adrian's heart hammered in his chest as he realized the potential of this discovery. The knowledge contained within those runes could change everything, if they could unlock its secrets. A chill ran down Adrian's spine as the boat slowly glided past the glowing patterns, the light from the symbols casting eerie reflections on the surface of the water. For a moment, he could have sworn that the reef itself seemed to react to their presence, the symbols flickering as though aware of their gaze. There was power here, undeniable, ancient power that lay dormant, waiting for someone to awaken it. The feeling in the air was electric, charged with the potential for both discovery and danger. Adrian knew they were standing on the brink of something momentous. Whether they would unlock the secrets of the reef or fall victim to its forgotten magic remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the Crimson Tempest had just sailed into uncharted waters, and nothing would ever be the same again. Liam's voice broke the heavy silence that had settled over the crew, his tone filled with awe as he pointed toward a cluster of glowing sea anemones nestled among the coral. Adrian followed his gaze, his breath catching as he took in the sight. The anemones glowed with an ethereal, pulsating light, each one expanding and contracting in perfect harmony with the ebb and flow of the ocean. The soft, rhythmic glow illuminated the surrounding water, casting long shadows on the coral below. It was as if the creatures were breathing in time with the very heartbeat of the sea itself, their movements a silent testament to the magical forces at work in the depths. The sight was mesmerizing, unlike anything Adrian had ever seen before. "It's like something out of a legend," Liam murmured, his voice reverberating with both wonder and disbelief. Adrian nodded, his own words lost for a moment as he watched the mesmerizing display before them. The sea anemones weren't just a natural phenomenon, they were a part of something larger, a living relic of an ancient world. There was a magic to their movements, a purpose behind their existence that Adrian couldn't yet fathom. The glow they emitted seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the ocean's tides, as if they were communicating with the waters themselves. It was a sight that felt almost sacred, as though the sea was revealing a hidden truth to those daring enough to explore its depths. The light from the anemones shimmered across the water's surface, casting iridescent reflections on the boat and the crew, giving everything an otherworldly glow. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the faint tang of ozone, the calm before the storm of realization settled over Adrian. He could feel the weight of this discovery settling upon him like an ancient mantle. These sea creatures, with their hypnotic glow and intricate movements, were not simply part of the reef. They were its guardians, its keepers, holding the secrets of the deep within their luminous embrace. It was as though the ocean had chosen to reveal a piece of itself to them, a gift wrapped in mystery and magic. The crew watched in silence, each person mesmerized by the pulsating beauty of the anemones, caught between the wonder of the moment and the creeping realization that this place held power far beyond their understanding. Adrian's mind raced with possibilities, but he knew they had to approach this discovery with caution. The anemones, like the reef itself, were a mystery, a beautiful, dangerous mystery. "Keep your wits about you," Adrian finally said, his voice steady despite the swirl of thoughts in his mind. "We don't know what magic is at work here, but we've come too far to turn back now." The crew nodded in silent agreement, their awe tempered with the knowledge that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. Adrian nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering from the glowing sea anemones and the reef stretching out before them. His expression was thoughtful, as though he were piecing together something that had been elusive for years. He said, his voice carrying the weight of his realization. "This reef is no ordinary place." He leaned forward slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the boat as his eyes scanned the magical landscape before him. "It's protected by something far older than us, something that holds secrets we may not fully understand." The words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of what they were encountering. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their awe tempered by the underlying tension in Adrian's voice. The reef had already shown them that it was no mere collection of coral and sea creatures. It was alive with an ancient force, something beyond the natural world. Adrian could feel it, deep in his bones. This was a place that time had forgotten, hidden beneath the waves, guarding something that might be too powerful for them to comprehend. The symbols etched into the coral, the creatures that glowed with unnatural light, all pointed to a force that had been dormant for centuries, perhaps millennia. The realization sent a ripple of unease through the crew. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at their sails, as if the sea itself was trying to communicate with them. The boat rocked gently in the water, its movements mirroring the rhythm of the reef's pulse. Adrian's mind raced with the implications of what lay before them. If this reef held such power, what had caused it to be forgotten? And why had it been left untouched for so long? He couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival was no accident, that they had been drawn here for a reason. Yet, with the pull of the reef's secrets came an undeniable sense of danger. What if they were not meant to uncover what was hidden beneath the waves? The crew fell silent, each man absorbed in his own thoughts as they drifted closer to the heart of the reef. Adrian's mind continued to churn with questions, but he knew one thing for certain: they were on the verge of something monumental. Whether they were prepared for it or not, the answers lay within the depths of this enchanted place. "We must tread carefully." Adrian finally spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. "Whatever we discover here, it will change everything. We must be ready for whatever comes next." The crew nodded, their resolve hardening. They had weathered many storms together, but this was a challenge that would test them all in ways they could never have anticipated. As the small boat glided through the calm waters of the reef, the crew's attention was drawn to something extraordinary. Partially submerged in the coral, almost as if it had been swallowed by the sea itself, stood an ancient stone archway. Time and the relentless ocean had worn down the stone, but the shape of the structure remained unmistakable, a forgotten relic of a past age. Thick layers of moss and tangled seaweed clung to its surface, as though nature itself sought to conceal its existence. Despite the wear of centuries, the archway exuded a quiet, unshakable sense of significance, like a threshold between the known world and something much older, much more mysterious. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he studied the archway, noting the delicate carvings that lined its weathered stones. Ancient runes were etched into the surface, their shapes intricate and unfamiliar, yet they seemed to hum with an unearthly rhythm. The air around the archway felt charged, vibrating with an almost imperceptible energy. It was as if the very atmosphere had thickened, the unseen power of the reef wrapping around them like a protective shroud. The water around the structure seemed to shimmer with a strange light, reflecting the arch's enigmatic glow, creating an ethereal aura that made the entire scene feel otherworldly. Adrian could feel the pull of it, an ancient magic that beckoned him closer. Liam, standing at Adrian's side, took a tentative step forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What is this, Captain?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. "It's like nothing I've ever seen before." Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached out with one hand, letting his fingers hover just above the surface of the water. He could feel the faint crackling of energy beneath his fingertips, like static before a storm, yet far more ancient. The sensation sent a shiver up his spine, but he remained motionless, absorbing the magnitude of the discovery. This archway, with its glowing runes and pulsing energy, was no mere part of the reef. It was a relic, a key to something that had long been forgotten. The crew watched in awe, some of them whispering among themselves, but Adrian held them in silence. He could sense that they were on the brink of something monumental, something that could change the course of their journey. The archway stood as a silent sentinel, guarding secrets that had long been lost to time. Whatever magic lingered here, it was far beyond their understanding, and yet it was undeniable. The archway was a doorway to the unknown, a challenge to their very existence. With a heavy breath, Adrian stepped forward, his hand finally brushing the stone. He could almost hear the faint whisper of an ancient voice in the wind, urging him to look deeper, to uncover the truths that had been buried beneath the waves for centuries. The adventure ahead had just taken a far more dangerous and mystical turn. "This must be the heart of the enchantment," Adrian murmured, his voice barely audible above the soft lapping of the water against the boat. His fingers gently traced the ancient symbols carved into the stone archway, the markings smooth under his touch, yet pulsating with a subtle, rhythmic energy. Each rune seemed to hold a story, a piece of a forgotten world woven into the very fabric of the reef itself. Adrian's mind raced, piecing together fragments of old tales, legends told by sailors and mystics alike. He had heard whispers of places where magic and nature were no longer separate, where the very essence of the land and sea became one. But never had he imagined that such a place would be real, let alone right before him. Liam watched Adrian, a mixture of awe and confusion on his face. "What kind of magic is this, Captain?" he asked, his voice thick with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. Adrian paused, lifting his gaze from the intricate carvings to the shimmering waters that surrounded them. The air felt charged, almost alive, as if the reef itself was breathing in time with the ocean. "I don't know, Liam," Adrian admitted, his brow furrowing in thought. "But whatever it is, it's ancient. It's as though the reef was built around this very magic, holding it in place, protecting it from the world above." He stepped back slightly, his eyes scanning the structure once more. "This is no mere natural formation. It's a gateway, a living relic of a time long past." The water around the archway seemed to pulse with an otherworldly glow, its colors shifting like the iridescence of a pearl. The magical energy surrounding the structure was undeniable, and it filled the crew with a sense of awe yet also unease. Even the air itself felt different, thick with the weight of ancient power. Adrian's heart raced as he realized they were standing at the edge of something far greater than anything they had encountered before. This wasn't just a place of beauty, it was a place of power, a nexus where forces older than time itself converged. The realization that they had stumbled upon such a sight filled him with both reverence and a simmering sense of danger. As the crew silently took in the sight before them, Adrian felt a strange pull to the reef, as if it was calling to him, inviting him to unlock its secrets. "I've heard tales of such places," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, "where magic and nature intertwine, where the sea itself holds memories that stretch back millennia. But I never thought I'd see one for myself." He took another step closer, his fingers tracing the glowing symbols once more. The sensation that washed over him was one of deep connection, a bond between himself and the ancient forces at play. He could feel it now. The reef was not just a location, but a living, breathing entity with a purpose, guarding something that had been hidden from the world for ages. It was a place where the past and present converged, and Adrian knew that whatever lay beyond this enchanted gateway would change everything they thought they knew about the world. The crew approached the ancient archway with a sense of awe that was almost tangible. The usual chatter and clatter of their daily tasks had fallen silent, replaced by a quiet reverence, as they moved closer to the structure. Each step seemed to draw them further into the heart of the enchantment, the very air thick with an unseen power. The water around them shimmered with a soft, ethereal glow, casting flickering reflections on their faces. The magical energy emanating from the archway was unlike anything they had felt before, an almost electric charge that seemed to ripple through their bodies, making their skin tingle and their hearts beat a little faster. Even the bravest among them couldn't ignore the subtle, creeping sense of wonder and fear that began to take root in their chests. As they neared the arch, the beauty of the reef seemed to intensify. The coral, so vibrant and alive, pulsed with colors that shifted like liquid light, rich blues, fiery reds, and electric greens that seemed to dance in harmony with the rhythm of the ocean. It was as though the reef itself was a living entity, its heart beating in tune with the crew's own. The symbols etched into the stones glowed faintly, their designs intricate and mysterious, as though they were waiting for someone to decipher their meaning. The very essence of the place felt like it was alive, shifting with the waves, and yet ancient beyond measure. The crew could sense that they were standing on the threshold of something momentous, something that was not meant for ordinary men. A hushed silence fell over the group, each crew member caught in the spell of the reef. The air seemed to thicken with an unspoken promise, the allure of the unknown tempting them forward. Adrian could see it in their eyes, the same mix of wonder and hesitation that he felt himself. This was not a place to be entered lightly. It was a place of magic, of old power, and the crew felt a deep, unspoken understanding that whatever lay beyond the archway would change their lives forever. The thrill of discovery surged through their veins, tempered by the heavy weight of the unknown. There was no going back now. The sea had drawn them here, and they would answer its call. The archway stood as both a beacon and a warning, its presence both inviting and intimidating. The crew felt themselves drawn to it, as though it was calling them, urging them to step forward into its embrace. It promised adventure, the kind of discovery that would etch their names into history, but it also whispered of danger, of secrets better left untouched. But in that moment, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the overcast sky, casting a warm glow over the water, they couldn't help but be captivated. The promise of the reef, of the magic and mysteries it held, was too great to resist. Whatever lay on the other side of the archway was waiting, and Adrian, with his crew at his side, was ready to uncover its secrets. The crew of the Crimson Tempest spent the remainder of the day fully immersed in the mysteries of the reef. Adrian led the charge, his mind racing as he studied the intricate carvings on the stone archway and the coral formations that surrounded them. The vibrant, bioluminescent creatures that swam through the water seemed to hold secrets of their own, their glowing forms moving like silent messengers from another age. The crew documented everything they saw, sketching the runes and taking notes on the creatures that flitted around them, hoping to piece together the ancient magic that enveloped the reef. With each discovery, they grew more certain that this place was not only a site of great natural beauty, but also a key to something far older and more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. As the sun climbed higher, its light caught the shimmering water, causing the reef's colors to shift and glow with an almost hypnotic brilliance. The crew moved from one spot to the next, drawn by the allure of the reef's endless wonders. Some members ventured into the shallows, their hands brushing against the smooth, iridescent surfaces of hidden stones. Others inspected the arcane symbols carved into the coral, their eyes squinting in concentration as they tried to decipher their meanings. Adrian stood at the heart of it all, his gaze fixed on the ancient runes etched into the archway, his thoughts whirling. He had always known there were mysteries on the high seas, but this reef was unlike any legend he had ever heard. As the day wore on, the light began to fade, and the sea grew quieter, the waves lapping gently at the boat's hull. The crew reluctantly turned back toward the Crimson Tempest, their minds filled with both excitement and uncertainty. The knowledge they had gained felt like a heavy burden, one that they couldn't quite grasp but couldn't ignore either. The magic of the reef was undeniable, and yet something about it felt unfinished, as if the true purpose of their discovery had yet to reveal itself. The once vibrant colors of the reef began to dim as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long, stretching shadows across the water, giving the entire scene an air of quiet mystery. The magical energy that had hung around them now seemed to settle, leaving an almost eerie stillness in its wake. By the time they returned to the Crimson Tempest, the crew was exhausted but filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of their discovery hung over them like an unspoken promise, one that both excited and unnerved them. Adrian stood at the helm, his eyes reflecting the fading light of the setting sun, his mind already racing with the implications of what they had found. He turned to his crew, his voice steady but laced with anticipation. "We've found something here, something important," he said, his gaze sweeping over the men who had shared in this incredible journey. "Tomorrow, we'll begin uncovering its secrets. But for tonight, let's rest. We've earned it." The crew nodded in agreement, their thoughts a mix of wonder and wariness, ready to face whatever the reef would reveal next. The magical reef stood as an enigmatic monument before Adrian and his crew, its secrets hidden beneath layers of time and ancient power. Despite the day's exploration, Adrian knew they had only scratched the surface of what the reef had to offer. The glowing ruins and strange creatures were just the beginning, and as he gazed out at the now tranquil waters, a sense of urgency stirred within him. He could feel the weight of the mysteries pulsing beneath the surface, beckoning them toward discovery. The reef wasn't just a curiosity, it was a key, one that could unlock paths to treasure, knowledge, or perhaps even forces beyond their understanding. The more Adrian thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly knew about the forces at play within the reef's shimmering expanse. The runes that had appeared to be just ancient carvings were clearly tied to something greater, perhaps a magic so old that even the most seasoned sailors had forgotten its existence. It wasn't just a symbol, it was an invitation, a map to something deeper, something hidden for centuries. His mind raced with the possibilities. What if the reef was part of something larger, a network of magic that spanned the seas? What if it held the key to untold power, or the answers to questions long forgotten by man? The more he thought about it, the more determined he became to unlock its secrets. Yet there was also a sense of caution that Adrian couldn't ignore. The reef's magic was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was raw, untamed, and perhaps even dangerous. There was a deep hum of energy that seemed to vibrate through the air and the water, a force that felt alive and aware of their presence. Every instinct told him to proceed carefully, to tread lightly and not rush into the unknown. The ancient magic of the reef could be a gift, but it could also be a curse. Adrian knew that some mysteries were best left uncovered. But his curiosity and the thrill of the unknown pushed him forward. This was a discovery unlike any other, and he couldn't allow fear to hold him back. As night settled over the crew, with the stars now a silent witness to their newfound purpose, Adrian stood at the helm, his mind ablaze with thoughts of the reef. The winds had calmed, but the fire within him was stronger than ever. The adventure that had begun with a storm and a ship was now leading them into uncharted waters, both literally and figuratively. The reef held more than just secrets. It held the potential to change everything, to take them beyond the limits of their current world. And Adrian, ever the explorer, knew that they were on the cusp of something extraordinary. The journey was far from over, and he was ready to see where the reef's magic would lead them next. As the reef slowly faded into the deepening twilight, its iridescent glow fading like the last embers of a fire, Adrian stood at the helm of the Crimson Tempest, his hands steady on the wheel. The sea around him seemed almost unnaturally calm now, the tumult of the previous day's storms a distant memory. But within Adrian, a storm of a different sort was stirring, one of curiosity, anticipation, and unshakable resolve. The reef had been a discovery, but it was only the beginning. He knew that the sea, vast and untamed, held countless secrets yet to be uncovered, and the thrill of the hunt coursed through his veins like a powerful tide. Adrian's gaze swept across the horizon, where the dark expanse of the ocean stretched endlessly, whispering promises of adventure and danger. The ancient magic of the reef was still fresh in his mind, the shimmering coral and glowing creatures vivid in his memory. But there was more to uncover, more mysteries beneath the surface, waiting for someone bold enough to seek them out. The thrill of the unknown had always called to him, and now, after the strange encounter with the reef, it seemed that the sea was calling him once more. The possibilities were endless, and he felt a burning desire to chase them all, to venture farther into the heart of the mysteries that lay hidden just beyond the horizon. His crew, worn and weary, had earned a moment's rest, but Adrian knew the quiet would not last long. There was too much to explore, too much to discover in a world as vast and wild as this one. His heart raced at the thought of the untold adventures that awaited. The ocean was not just a home, it was a living, breathing entity, its mysteries locked away beneath its surface like treasure in a chest. And Adrian Blackwood was determined to find the key to those mysteries. His mind drifted to the ancient runes carved into the stone archway, to the strange, pulsing energy that had radiated from the reef, and to the promise that magic, old and powerful, was still very much alive in the world. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beneath the horizon, Adrian felt a surge of energy, as though the very sea itself was beckoning him forward. There was no fear, no hesitation in his heart, just the certainty that this was where he belonged. The adventures that lay ahead were more than just quests for treasure. They were journeys into the unknown, into the heart of the world's oldest mysteries. With his crew at his side and the wind at his back, Adrian knew that whatever came next, he was ready. The sea held many secrets, and he would chase them all, no matter where they led. Chapter 3: Shipwrecked. The Crimson Tempest sat like a wounded beast upon the rolling sea, its once vibrant sails now shredded and limp, hanging like tattered flags in the wake of the storm's fury. The violent winds that had assaulted them for hours had done their damage, leaving behind a vessel that felt as though it had aged 100 years in a single night. The ship bobbed uneasily on the gentle swell, its movements slow and labored, as if it were uncertain whether to fight the tide or surrender to it. Each creak of the ship's wooden frame echoed through the still air, a constant reminder of the violent struggle it had just endured. Adrian Blackwood stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of land or safety, though the darkness of the sky offered little in the way of clarity. His thoughts were sharp, as always, but even he couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him. The tempest had passed, but the damage to the Crimson Tempest was evident in the battered masts, the shredded ropes, and the countless small repairs that would need to be made if they were to continue their journey. The ship's proud figurehead, once gleaming with fierce determination, now appeared bruised and scarred, a reflection of the crew's wearied spirits. Yet, it was not the physical damage that truly concerned Adrian. The storm had been vicious, but it was only the first part of the ordeal. There was something in the air, something that felt wrong, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The sea, which had once been a partner in their adventures, now felt distant and unwelcoming. The waves, which had once danced beneath the ship's keel, now seemed to whisper in a language Adrian could not understand. The calm after the storm was unnervingly still, as though nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Liam, Adrian's first mate, approached quietly from behind, his steps slow and deliberate as he made his way to the captain's side. "It's bad, Captain," Liam said, his voice low, eyes scanning the ship's damaged sails and rigging. "We'll need to take the time to repair it, or we'll be stranded out here. But I get the sense, something else is out there. Something we can't see." The unease in Liam's voice mirrored Adrian's own, and for a brief moment, the two men stood in silence, sharing the same quiet apprehension. Adrian nodded grimly, his gaze never wavering from the horizon. He had seen storms before, had weathered worse than this, but there was an undercurrent to this one that he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the storm's violence that had left its mark, it was the sense that something far more dangerous had been unleashed in its wake. The winds had calmed, the waves had settled, but the world still felt on edge. The crew's exhaustion was palpable, but they would need to push through. If they were to survive what lay ahead, they would need to focus on the task at hand, repair the ship, restore order, and prepare for whatever the sea had yet to throw at them. With a deep breath, Adrian turned back to face the crew, his mind already working through the steps needed to secure their survival. The storm had tested them, but they had come through it. Now it was time to face the next challenge. He looked over his shoulder at Liam, then back at the ship, his expression hardening with determination. "Get the men to work," Adrian ordered, his voice sharp. "We repair what we can and get this ship back in fighting shape. The sea's not done with us yet, and neither are we." As his crew began to move, Adrian's eyes narrowed in the direction of the calm, empty sea. The storm had passed, but the true danger was still out there, just beyond the horizon. Captain Adrian Blackwood stood at the helm, his hands gripping the wheel with a firm but steady hold, as the ship drifted through the calm aftermath of the storm. His eyes, sharp and focused, scanned the horizon with a mixture of determination and concern. The sea, now eerily still, stretched out before him in all directions, its vast expanse seemingly indifferent to the chaos that had just unfolded. The storm had passed, but the sense of unease remained, clinging to the ship like the salt water still dripping from the sails. Adrian's mind raced through possible courses of action, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead left a gnawing feeling deep in his chest. Behind him, the crew worked with quiet urgency, moving from task to task with the practiced efficiency born of years at sea. They were battered and bruised, their clothes soaked through with the remnants of the storm, but there was no time to rest. They had weathered the storm, but the Crimson Tempest was far from unscathed. The sails were torn, ropes were frayed, and the rigging had taken a beating. Even the ship's hull had been strained by the relentless battering of the waves. Despite the exhaustion that hung over them like a cloud, the crew pressed on, each man and woman knowing that survival depended on their ability to restore order to the chaos that had enveloped them. Adrian's eyes flickered over the crew, noting the weariness in their movements and the silent tension in their posture. Every swing of the hammer, every pull of the rope, was a reminder of the storm's fury, and yet, there was a quiet sense of pride among them. They had been through worse, and they had survived. As the sun began to climb higher in the sky, casting a pale light over the ship, Adrian felt a deep resolve settle within him. The sea had tested them, but it had not broken them. If anything, it had strengthened their bond, the bond between captain and crew, between ship and sailors. Together, they would repair what had been damaged, and they would sail on. Still, Adrian's gaze never left the horizon. The storm may have passed, but the feeling of unease lingered, a subtle undercurrent that tugged at him with every passing moment. The sea, for all its beauty and bounty, was a treacherous mistress, and Adrian knew that the calm after the storm was often more dangerous than the storm itself. There was no telling what threats might be lurking beneath the surface or just beyond the horizon, waiting for an opportunity to strike. His mind flickered briefly to the strange energy they had encountered in the magical reef, the symbols etched into the coral, the glowing creatures that had flitted around them. Was that a sign of something more? Or had the storm stirred up forces they weren't prepared for? The sound of footsteps behind him broke Adrian from his thoughts. He turned slightly to find Liam, his first mate, approaching with a furrowed brow. "Captain," Liam said, his voice low but urgent. "We've patched up what we can for now, but we'll need more time to make proper repairs. The sails and rigging won't hold for long if we don't give them the attention they need." His eyes flickered to the horizon, then back to Adrian, his expression reflecting the same unease that had settled over the captain. "The men are tired, but they'll press on if you give the order. What's our course?" Adrian took a deep breath, his gaze drifting once again to the endless expanse of water. His thoughts were clear, as always, but the weight of the decisions ahead pressed heavily on him. They had come through the storm, but they were far from out of danger. The unknown lay ahead, and whatever challenges the sea had in store for them, they would face them together. With a firm nod, Adrian finally turned to his first mate. "Set a course for the nearest port," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We'll make what repairs we can there. But keep your eyes open, Liam. The storm may be over, but something tells me the sea isn't done with us yet." "Captain, the rudder's been damaged," Liam reported, his voice strained with a mixture of frustration and concern. His usually composed demeanor was frayed, and the tension in his words was a clear sign of the urgency of the situation. Adrian's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening slightly as he turned toward Liam, his mind already working through the implications of such a setback. The rudder was the ship's lifeblood, the mechanism that allowed them to navigate the open sea with any semblance of control. Without it, they were at the mercy of the ocean, a drifting vessel with no clear direction. "Damn it," Adrian muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the wheel. His gaze flickered to the crew members who were already scrambling below deck to assess the damage. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. The ship's trajectory had already begun to shift, a subtle but dangerous veer off course, and Adrian could feel the pull of uncertainty in the way the Crimson Tempest moved. Without the rudder's full functionality, they could end up stranded or worse, at the mercy of the next storm, or a pirate ship waiting to pounce. Liam hesitated for a moment before answering, his eyes flicking over the ship's stern. "It's not completely gone, but the damage is severe," he said, his brow furrowing as he surveyed the crew working frantically to stabilize the ship. "We're having trouble getting a clean course, and if we don't fix it soon, we'll be stuck drifting." The wind had shifted, and now they were at risk of being blown further off course, possibly into the open sea where no land was in sight. The crew's efforts were admirable, but without Adrian's command, they would be powerless to remedy the situation on their own. "We'll need to make repairs fast, Captain. If we don't, we risk losing the ability to steer entirely." Adrian's mind raced as he assessed their options. The nearest port was still too far to reach in the current condition of the ship, and they couldn't afford to drift aimlessly, especially when they had no way of knowing what dangers the open sea might bring. His eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of land or other ships that might be able to offer assistance. But the sea stretched endlessly before him, a blank canvas that offered no answers. He had faced storms before, but this was different. This was a challenge that could leave them stranded, at the mercy of the ocean's whims. "We can't afford to drift," Adrian said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the rising chaos around him. "Get the crew together and begin repairs immediately. We'll have to make do with what we've got for now." His eyes locked onto Liam's, a look of fierce determination passing between them. "We're not helpless out here. I want everyone working on this, and I mean everyone. We'll fix it ourselves if we have to. This ship isn't going down today." Liam gave a sharp nod, his expression hardening as he turned to rally the crew. Adrian stood at the helm, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the crew mobilize. The ship groaned under the strain, its frame still reeling from the storm's fury, but Adrian knew they couldn't afford to lose control now. Every moment counted. With a deep breath, he focused on steadying the wheel, using all his strength to guide the Crimson Tempest as best he could, knowing that even if the rudder was damaged, the crew's resilience could carry them through the storm. There was no turning back now. They would survive, or they would sink together. Adrian's gaze followed Liam's pointing finger, and his heart sank as he saw the ship's precarious position. The Crimson Tempest was drifting dangerously close to the magical reef they had encountered earlier, its once beautiful, vibrant colors now a terrifying sight. The glowing coral, which had once beckoned them with its promise of adventure and mystery, now stood as a menacing obstacle. The swirling hues of blue, purple, and green had an ominous aura in the fading light, their hypnotic beauty no longer capable of masking the reef's deadly nature. Adrian's stomach churned as he realized just how close they were to disaster. The ship was no longer responding to the helm as it should. With the rudder damaged and the storm's aftermath still wreaking havoc on the vessel, they were at the mercy of the currents and wind. The reef's jagged spires, now more prominent in the dimming twilight, jutted out of the water like the teeth of some ancient beast. Each passing wave seemed to carry them closer, and Adrian could already hear the sharp scrape of coral against wood in his mind. The Crimson Tempest was a sturdy ship, but the sea and its natural defenses were not to be underestimated. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and they would be torn apart by the very beauty they had marveled at only hours ago. "Hard to port, Liam!" Adrian commanded, his voice sharp as he fought to steady the wheel. But the response was sluggish, and the ship seemed to resist his efforts. He gritted his teeth, hands tightening on the wheel, willing the Crimson Tempest to obey him. But the ship was as tired as its crew, battered by the storm and now fighting a slow, inevitable drift toward the reef. Time was running out, and Adrian could feel the pressure mounting with every passing second. The reef, once an enchanting marvel of the ocean, was now a looming reminder of their vulnerability in this unpredictable world. Liam, his face pale with concern, grabbed a nearby crew member's arm and barked orders to the others. "Get those lines tightened. We need to slow this drift before we're on top of it." He rushed to assist, but the crew's frantic movements did little to change their trajectory. It was clear that even their best efforts might not be enough to stop the ship from running aground. Adrian's thoughts raced as he considered the possibility of abandoning ship, but he quickly dismissed it. The Crimson Tempest was their home, their livelihood, and the idea of leaving it to the mercy of the ocean was unthinkable. Adrian took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising tide of panic that threatened to cloud his judgment. He scanned the horizon, looking for anything that could help them, anything that could offer a way out. But the sea was empty, and the sky had turned a foreboding shade of purple. The lighthouse they had glimpsed earlier was now miles away, and there was no sign of any other ships on the horizon. It was just them and the Crimson Tempest, with no guarantees of survival. The magic of the reef, once something to be revered, now felt like a cruel trick, an invitation to adventure that had led them to the brink of disaster. "Hold steady, lads," Adrian said, his voice gruff but steady as he turned to face the crew. "We've faced worse before, and we'll face it again if we have to. Get those sails ready for a last push. We're not giving up without a fight." His eyes met Liam's, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. They were in this together, as they always had been, and no matter how dire the situation, they would not go down without trying everything they could. As the crew sprang into action, Adrian's focus returned to the reef, knowing that their lives were now tied to the ship's survival and the sea's mercy. "Damn it!" Adrian muttered under his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel tightly. The wind howled through the rigging, snapping the remaining sails in the air like angry flags. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought the ship's sluggish response to the helm, his mind racing. The Crimson Tempest was drifting ever closer to the reef, its bow swinging dangerously toward the jagged coral. Every passing second felt like an eternity, and the low groan of the ship's hull beneath him only added to the tension, as if the vessel itself was fighting against the inevitable. "We need to steer clear before the reef tears us apart," Adrian said with an urgency that was almost foreign to him. It was rare that Adrian Blackwood, the legendary pirate captain, ever found himself in such a precarious position. The sea, once a vast expanse of promise and mystery, now felt like an unforgiving enemy. The storm had left the Crimson Tempest battered and broken, and the damage to the rudder was only amplifying their helplessness. With each passing wave, they were pushed closer to the reef, its dark outline becoming sharper, more threatening in the dim light of the evening sky. Adrian's eyes darted to the glowing expanse beneath the water, now more menacing than ever. The magical colors that had once captivated him now seemed like a cruel mirage, a trap that had drawn them in, only to swallow them whole. He knew that the Crimson Tempest was tough, but no ship could survive a collision with those sharp, unforgiving spires. Adrian glanced over his shoulder at the crew, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. They were working with frantic energy, but their efforts seemed to be in vain. The lines creaked under strain as they tried to adjust the sails, but without proper steering, their movements felt almost futile. The crew's usual confidence had faltered. They knew as well as Adrian that this might be a battle they wouldn't win. "Get those ropes tighter! We need to halt the drift!" Liam shouted to the men, his voice strained. His eyes were wide with concern, his usual bravado slipping under the weight of their situation. Adrian could see the worry in his first mate's face, mirrored by the other crew members. The Crimson Tempest had carried them through countless battles and treacherous waters, but today it seemed as if even the legendary ship might not be enough. With every wave that struck the hull, Adrian felt the ship shift slightly, her movement growing more unpredictable. The water was becoming choppy, and the current was relentless, dragging them closer to the looming threat of the reef. It was clear now that the danger wasn't just the coral's sharp edges, but the hidden currents that swirled around it. The sea was alive with dangerous intent. "Come on, damn it," Adrian growled, his eyes narrowing as he forced the wheel to turn, trying to push the ship away from the encroaching danger. But the Crimson Tempest was slower than it should have been, too sluggish to respond as it once had. The feeling of helplessness gnawed at him, a feeling Adrian was not used to, a feeling he couldn't afford to indulge. The air grew heavier as the ship creaked ominously under the pressure, and the once welcome sound of the waves crashing against the ship now felt like the countdown to disaster. The reef was so close now that Adrian could almost hear the sharp slap of coral against the hull in his mind. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to act, to do something, anything, to avoid the inevitable. He glanced over at the crew again, their faces grim as they struggled to maintain their footing on the slick, rain-drenched deck. Despite their best efforts, the Crimson Tempest seemed to have a mind of its own, one that was slowly but surely steering them toward the reef's deadly embrace. Time was running out. "Hard to port! Hard to port, now!" Adrian barked, his voice hoarse from the strain. He felt the ship's resistance with every inch of movement, as if it was fighting him. His breath quickened, and his pulse thrummed in his ears. The reef was so close now that it felt as if the ship was merely inches away from disaster. His mind raced with the knowledge that this was the moment that would decide their fate. One wrong move, one misstep, and the Crimson Tempest would be torn apart, her crew lost to the depths of the ocean. Adrian refused to let that happen. He refused to go down without a fight. He clenched his teeth, determined that he would steer them out of this mess, if only the ship would respond to him. The crew worked frantically, their movements tense and disjointed as they struggled to patch up the damaged rudder. Every moment spent trying to repair the vital piece of the ship felt like an eternity. With the rudder crippled, the Crimson Tempest had lost much of its ability to steer, drifting helplessly toward the looming reef. Adrian paced back and forth at the helm, eyes darting between the crew and the growing menace ahead. The men worked with desperation, trying to reinforce the rudder as best they could, but the damage was extensive. Large chunks of wood had splintered away during the storm, and there was little hope of a quick fix. The crew's hands were blistered and bloody from the effort, their faces drawn and weary. But they kept at it, knowing how crucial it was to get the ship under control. As they toiled with the repairs, the ship's movement became more erratic. Every wave sent the Crimson Tempest lurching, throwing the men off balance as they tried to keep their footing on the slick deck. The creaking of the ship's wooden frame grew louder with each passing moment, a constant reminder that the ship was in a fragile state. The sails flapped wildly, unable to be controlled, and the ship veered wildly off course. Adrian's stomach churned as he watched the reef grow closer, the jagged tips of the coral stalk against the darkened water. The Crimson Tempest seemed to fight its own course, almost as if it was unwilling to leave the danger behind. The ship's erratic movements were a deadly dance with fate. The water beneath the ship had changed, its once tranquil beauty now transformed into a swirling vortex of color and menace. The vibrant hues of the magical reef had turned into something more sinister, twisting and swirling in unnatural patterns, as though the ocean itself was trying to draw the ship into its depths. The colors were no longer calming but pulsating with a frantic energy, each turn of the water bringing the ship closer to the treacherous coral below. The eerie, bioluminescent creatures that had once danced playfully beneath the surface now swirled in disturbed circles, their glowing bodies flashing erratically as if sensing the ship's peril. Their strange movements only added to the growing tension, as if the very creatures of the reef were rallying against the Crimson Tempest. Adrian gripped the wheel harder, his jaw clenched, trying to keep the ship steady despite its uncontrollable sway. His mind raced through every possible solution, but all he could see was the approaching wall of coral, the deadly teeth of the reef that would tear through the ship if they didn't manage to steer away. The crew had done their best to fix the rudder, but it was clear now that their work had been in vain. The damage was too severe, and there was no way to get the ship back on course. Panic was setting in, and Adrian could feel the weight of the crew's eyes on him, waiting for some sign of leadership, something to guide them through the chaos. But as the ship dipped dangerously toward the reef, Adrian knew that there might be no way to avoid the inevitable. The bioluminescent creatures around them had grown more agitated, their glowing bodies flashing brighter and faster, casting strange and ominous shadows across the water's surface. Their erratic movements were like an unspoken warning, a sign that the reef was alive with an energy that reacted to the presence of the ship. The sea itself seemed to be alive, its waters churning violently as if it had a mind of its own. The eerie glow of the creatures had intensified, casting an unnatural light on the crew, who struggled against the relentless tide. Adrian's heart hammered in his chest as the water surged and bucked beneath them. The Crimson Tempest was in the eye of a storm it couldn't escape, trapped between the forces of nature and the malice of the reef. The ship's bow dipped lower as they drew closer to the deadly coral. Adrian's voice rang out through the chaos, cutting through the sounds of crashing waves and the crew's frantic shouts. "Brace for impact!" he yelled, his voice hoarse with fear and urgency. He could feel the ship's final moments approaching, the sense of inevitability rising like a tidal wave. The crew held on, gritting their teeth as they braced themselves for the impact, but Adrian could see the reef closing in faster than they could react. Time had run out, and it seemed there was nothing left to do but wait for the Crimson Tempest to meet its fate. "Prepare to drop anchor!" Adrian's voice rang out above the roar of the storm, cutting through the chaos like a sharp blade. His words were urgent, driven by the ever-growing sense of impending disaster as the Crimson Tempest drifted perilously closer to the reef. The wind howled and the rain lashed against the crew, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his tone. The ship's erratic movements made it impossible to get a steady bearing on the reef, and the danger was closing in with each passing second. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he gripped the wheel, trying to steady the ship despite the broken rudder, his mind racing to find any way to stop their inevitable collision. Liam, who stood nearby at the edge of the deck, immediately sprang into action, shouting orders to the crew. The men worked frantically, scrambling across the slick surface of the ship to the anchor chains. The storm had turned the deck into a hazardous battlefield, with the waves crashing relentlessly over them, but the crew was no stranger to adversity. Their faces were grim, their expressions set in determined focus as they raced against the clock to secure the anchor. Despite the exhaustion written across their faces, there was a sense of unity in their movements. They had faced countless challenges before, but this was different. The threat of the reef was not something they could fight with their usual tactics. The anchor was finally brought up, the chains rattling as the crew struggled to secure it. But the ship was moving so wildly that it was almost impossible to get a firm hold. The Crimson Tempest shuddered as the anchor was dropped, but the force of the ocean's currents made it difficult for the ship to halt its forward momentum. The wind howled in protest, pushing the ship further toward the deadly coral. Adrian's heart raced as he watched the reef loom larger, the jagged teeth of the coral becoming clearer with every passing wave. The ship creaked under the pressure, and Adrian's knuckles went white as he gripped the wheel harder, praying that the anchor would hold long enough to give them a fighting chance. The crew strained with all their might, pulling the ropes tighter, hoping to slow the ship's relentless drift. The anchor had caught, but only just. The water beneath the ship churned with violent fury, swirling around the anchor's chain, pulling the Crimson Tempest in different directions with each crashing wave. The crew was struggling to keep their footing, desperately attempting to pull the ship away from the reef's deadly grasp. Adrian, standing at the helm, could feel the stress of the ship's frame as it groaned and creaked beneath the pressure. His mind raced through every possible solution, but none came to him in time. The wind and the water were relentless, and no matter how much they pulled, the ship felt as though it was caught in the reef's pull. "Steady, lads!" Liam shouted, his voice carrying through the tumult. "We can't let her drag us in. Keep those ropes tight, or it's the end for all of us." The crew pulled with renewed strength, their bodies straining against the unforgiving elements. The ship's movement slowed, but not enough to completely avoid the coral formations looming ahead. Adrian could see the sharp edges of the reef scraping against the water's surface, waiting to tear through the ship's hull. His stomach tightened in dread as he realized they were still on a dangerous path, but the anchor had slowed their progress, giving them a slight chance of pulling away. The ship lurched violently, sending a wave of panic through the crew. For a moment, Adrian thought they had reached the point of no return, but then the anchor held fast, and the ship's momentum began to slow. The tension in the air was palpable, every man on deck holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable impact. Adrian's heart raced as the ship groaned again, and then, finally, the Crimson Tempest stopped moving. They had avoided the worst, but the danger wasn't over. The crew, drenched and exhausted, collapsed on the wet deck, their bodies heaving with relief, but their eyes still wary. Adrian stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the ominous reef that still loomed too close for comfort. They had bought themselves a moment, but the real test was far from over. The crew scrambled frantically to deploy the anchor, but the ship's unstable motion made their task nearly impossible. The Crimson Tempest pitched and swayed under the battering waves, its damaged rudder making every movement unpredictable. Crew members struggled to keep their footing, their hands slick with seawater as they hauled on the ropes and adjusted the sails. Each wave that struck the ship sent them stumbling, and the rain hammered down with relentless fury, blurring their vision and adding to the confusion. Still, they worked with urgency, knowing that the ship's survival, and their own, depended on their ability to act quickly. The anchor, already on the deck, seemed to mock their efforts as the ship continued its perilous drift toward the jagged teeth of the reef. Adrian stood at the wheel, his grip tight, knuckles white against the polished wood. His eyes were locked on the approaching reef, now just a few hundred yards away, the sharp coral formations cutting through the water like the claws of some monstrous creature. The Crimson Tempest groaned and creaked as it was tossed about by the fury of the storm, and Adrian could feel the strain in the ship's frame. The constant motion made it difficult to make any headway in stopping the ship's trajectory, and his mind raced, weighing the options. "We have to slow her down," He muttered to himself, barely able to hear the words over the crashing waves. If we don't stop now, it'll be too late. Liam, his first mate, was shouting orders across the deck, trying to keep the crew focused despite the chaos. Get those ropes tight, Liam bellowed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. If we don't hold fast, she'll drag us right into the rocks. But even as the crew scrambled to comply, the ship's erratic motion was proving too much to manage. The anchor, normally a reliable tool for halting a ship's movement, was struggling to find purchase in the churning water. The Crimson Tempest surged forward again, inching ever closer to the jagged reef. The heavy weight of the anchor seemed to have little effect on the ship's momentum, and every moment that passed seemed to bring them closer to the inevitable crash. Adrian's mind raced, but there was little he could do in that moment except to hold the wheel steady and pray that the crew could maintain control. The wind howled and the waves lashed at the ship, making every task feel like a battle against nature itself. The anchor's chain rattled, and the crew's voices became a distant murmur beneath the storm's roar. With every passing second, the reef loomed closer, the glimmering, dangerous shapes of coral growing larger, ready to tear the ship apart. The captain's heart pounded in his chest, but he held firm, unwilling to let fear or panic take hold. The Crimson Tempest was his ship, and he would not let it succumb to the ocean's wrath without a fight. The crew's efforts were beginning to show signs of success, the anchor finally catching on something solid beneath the surface. But it was clear the ship was still moving toward the reef. The ropes were pulled taut, the ship's forward motion slowing, but not enough. Adrian could feel the strain on the anchor and knew that, even with all their might, they couldn't stop the ship's drift completely. It was a race against time, and the gap between them and the reef was closing with each surge of the ocean. The air was thick with tension, every man aboard aware that the slightest misstep could send them crashing into the unforgiving coral. Then, with a sudden shudder, the Crimson Tempest jerked to a halt. The anchor, caught at last, had held fast in the swirling currents, stopping the ship's forward momentum just inches from the deadly reef. The crew let out a collective breath of relief, their bodies sagging with exhaustion but their spirits lifted by the reprieve. Adrian remained at the wheel, his gaze fixed on the looming coral ahead, but for the first time in what felt like hours, the immediate danger had passed. The ship was no longer at the mercy of the storm and the reef, but Adrian knew they weren't out of danger yet. The anchor held, but the storm still raged, and the battle for survival was far from over. A sudden, violent jolt sent the crew stumbling across the deck, their feet slipping as the ship lurched unpredictably. The Crimson Tempest groaned in protest, its wooden frame protesting against the brutal impact. The force of the collision with the reef was undeniable, and the ship scraped painfully against the coral's sharp edges, sending a shower of splinters into the air. The sound of cracking wood echoed across the deck, sharp and unsettling, as if the ship itself were crying out in pain. The relentless crash of the waves against the hull only added to the chaos, the storm still raging around them as the men scrambled to maintain their footing. Adrian's heart skipped a beat as the ship bucked beneath him, the wheel almost slipping from his hands. His eyes darted to the side, where jagged coral formations were now visible beneath the churning water, their edges like the teeth of some ancient sea monster. The ship's hull scraped across the reef, sending a shiver through his bones. He could feel the Crimson Tempest shudder with each new impact, the sound of wood groaning and splintering growing louder with each passing second. The ship was caught, its progress halted, but the damage was already done. He gritted his teeth, fury and fear mixing in his chest. They had to act fast or the ship would be torn apart. The crew was in disarray, their every step hindered by the violent movement of the ship. Men were thrown to the ground as the Crimson Tempest lurched again, and those who managed to stay on their feet were desperately grabbing for anything solid to keep from being thrown overboard. The ropes on the deck were whipped about by the wind, and loose planks of wood skittered across the surface, adding to the chaos. Several of the men shouted for help, their voices lost in the roar of the storm and the crash of the waves. The ship's movements were erratic, swaying back and forth as it struggled against the coral's grip. Liam was the first to regain his balance, his voice rising above the cacophony of the storm. "Get the pumps! Now!" he shouted, his tone commanding. He rushed toward the starboard side, where the ship had taken the brunt of the impact, and began checking the hull for breaches. Water was already beginning to flood the lower decks, and if they didn't stop the leaks soon, the Crimson Tempest would sink under the weight of the storm and the damage. Adrian watched him go, his eyes briefly flicking to the men who were struggling to secure the ropes and prevent the ship from being pushed further onto the reef. It was a race against time, and the odds were slipping further out of their favor. The ship lurched again, this time with a sickening crack that seemed to come from deep within the hull. The force of the impact pushed several men off their feet, and a few of them crashed into the railing, their bodies bruised from the violent movement. Adrian's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel with everything he had, trying to steady the ship as it continued to scrape across the reef. His mind raced, weighing every possible course of action, but there was no clear solution. The storm was too fierce, the damage too severe. All they could do now was hold on, and hope the ship could survive long enough to be freed from the reef. Suddenly, a massive wave crested over the ship, crashing down with brutal force. The Crimson Tempest buckled under the weight of the water, and Adrian's eyes widened in horror as the wave engulfed the starboard side, sending men scrambling to higher ground. The ship groaned and shuddered again, this time with a more foreboding sound, as if it was protesting its own survival. The men who had been below deck rushed up to the main deck, their faces pale as they saw the severity of the damage. It was clear now that the Crimson Tempest would not last much longer if they didn't get her off the reef. Adrian's heart hammered in his chest as he surveyed the scene before him. The ship was at its breaking point, and they were running out of time. "Everyone to the port side!" he bellowed, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the storm. "We need to shift her weight and break free from the reef. Move now!" The crew sprang into action, their movements frantic but precise. It was a last-ditch effort, a desperate bid to save the Crimson Tempest from the reef's deadly grip. With all their strength, they worked together to shift the weight of the ship, hoping against hope that it would be enough to free them from the coral's hold. "Hold fast!" Adrian roared, his voice filled with urgency, cutting through the chaos of the storm. His grip on the wheel tightened as the ship continued to buck violently beneath him. The Crimson Tempest creaked and groaned, its wooden frame straining against the weight of the water crashing against its sides. Waves slammed into the hull with relentless force, threatening to tear the vessel apart. But Adrian refused to let go, his eyes locked on the dark, roiling sea around them. His crew was still scrambling to secure everything they could, their movements desperate as they worked together to keep the ship from breaking apart. The wind howled, whipping through the rigging with a ferocity that sent the sails flapping like thunderous wings. The storm had not let up, and every second seemed to bring the ship closer to disaster. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the men work feverishly across the deck, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Yet there was something in their eyes, something that told him they weren't ready to give up. They had been through storms before, and they would make it through this one too. He had to believe that. "We hold together!" Adrian shouted over the roar of the tempest, rallying his men with every ounce of his strength. Liam, his first mate, was the first to respond, his voice sharp and steady despite the conditions. "Aye, Captain. We'll make it through, just keep her steady." Liam worked alongside the rest of the crew, helping to secure the rigging and prevent the sails from tearing. The ship shuddered beneath them, and the force of another wave sent water splashing over the deck, soaking the men through. But they didn't falter. There was no time for hesitation. They knew what was at stake. Adrian could feel the strain of the storm in his bones, but he stood firm, unwilling to let the tempest claim them. The Crimson Tempest pitched violently as another massive wave surged forward, nearly sweeping some of the men off their feet. But Adrian's shout rallied them, and the crew clung to the rigging, ropes, and anything they could grasp. The ship groaned under the pressure, its hull scraping against unseen rocks beneath the churning waters. The storm's fury seemed endless, and the sight of the swirling, inky black sea was both a threat and a reminder of how fragile their situation truly was. Yet Adrian held his position, his eyes scanning the horizon, looking for any sign that the storm might be nearing its end. There had to be something, anything, that would turn their fortune. With each passing moment, the crimson tempest seemed to lurch further into the storm's grasp. The waves rose higher, crashing over the side of the ship, soaking the crew in an unforgiving cascade of water. The wind screeched as it tore through the sails, and the lightning illuminated the sky in flashes of blinding white. But through it all, Adrian's voice never wavered. "Keep pushing!" he shouted, his words a force of will against the chaos. His men followed his command without question, their exhaustion pushing them only harder. Together, they fought the storm, unwilling to let it claim their ship or their lives. Despite the odds, Adrian's resolve remained unshaken. His crew's strength was unmatched, and he could feel their collective will binding them together, an unspoken promise of survival. The Crimson Tempest was battered and bruised, but it was not yet broken. As the storm raged on, Adrian gripped the wheel with renewed determination. His men had given everything they had, and he would do the same. There was no turning back now. They either weathered this storm together or they didn't make it through at all. "Hold fast!" he bellowed again, his voice carrying over the storm, reaching every corner of the ship. "We're not done yet!" The storm's fury seemed endless, but Adrian refused to let the fear creep in. As the rain pelted down and the waves threatened to engulf them, he stood tall at the helm, a beacon of unwavering leadership. The crew's movements had become almost instinctual, a well-rehearsed rhythm in the midst of chaos. The ship continued to fight against the storm, its timbers straining with every crash of the waves. But together, they were making it through. They had weathered worse, and they would weather this too. The Crimson Tempest may have been battered, but as long as Adrian and his crew remained steadfast, it would never be truly broken. The storm had not yet fully released its grip on the Crimson Tempest. Though the winds had eased, the sea remained a chaotic and turbulent expanse, still agitated from the storm's fury. The crew, weary but determined, scrambled across the slick deck, their efforts focused on preventing further damage to the ship. Waves continued to crash over the sides, drenching them with cold, salt water. Their movements were frantic, each person working in a frenzy to secure the rigging, patch the sails, and keep the ship's damaged rudder from causing a deadly spin. Despite their efforts, the ship's course remained unstable, and the danger of the reef loomed ever closer. Adrian stood at the helm, his knuckles white against the wheel, the wood creaking and groaning beneath his grip. His eyes flicked back and forth between the rudder, which had been severely damaged during the storm, and the jagged outline of the reef that loomed ominously on the horizon. The ship veered dangerously to the left, its trajectory spiraling toward the perilous rocks. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan to steer them clear, but time was running out. He could feel the weight of the crew's expectations, the urgency pressing against his chest. If they didn't act quickly, the Crimson Tempest would be torn apart by the unforgiving coral beneath. Liam, his first mate, was beside him in an instant, barking orders to the crew as they scrambled to address the rudder's malfunction. "Steady, lads! Hold the ropes!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the last remnants of the storm's fury. The men worked tirelessly to secure anything they could to stabilize the ship's movements, but with the rudder compromised, their efforts were only temporary. Every wave that rocked the ship seemed to bring them closer to disaster, the reef's jagged teeth waiting just beneath the surface. Adrian's gaze never wavered from the treacherous path ahead, his mind turning over every possible solution, but nothing seemed immediate enough to turn the tide. The water around them began to shift, the currents swirling in unpredictable patterns as if responding to the ship's struggle. The eerie bioluminescent glow of the reef seemed to pulse in time with the rolling waves, its unnatural light casting strange shadows across the sea. Adrian could feel the weight of the reef's presence, as if it was calling to the Crimson Tempest, tempting it to crash against its deadly embrace. He clenched his jaw, refusing to let fear creep in. There had to be a way out. He could see the crew working tirelessly on deck, their faces a mix of fear and determination, each man giving everything they had to keep the ship afloat. Their resilience was the only thing that gave him hope. In the distance, he could see the outlines of the reefs drawing nearer, the jagged rock formations almost tangible in their menacing approach. The ship's erratic movement, driven by the damaged rudder and the unstable currents, made it impossible to make a clean escape. The ship groaned again, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the deck as another wave slammed against them. Adrian's grip tightened, his mind narrowing to the pressing need to act quickly. He glanced at Liam, who was shouting commands to the crew, but even with their best efforts, the Crimson Tempest continued to drift, helplessly drawn toward the rocks. With a sudden realization, Adrian snapped into action. "Cut the sails!" he ordered, his voice firm despite the chaos around him. The crew responded without hesitation, working swiftly to release the tension in the sails and slow the ship's momentum. Adrian adjusted the wheel as best as he could, using the last of his strength to guide the ship in a direction that might save them. The waves still crashed against the sides, but now there was a faint hope. The ship's speed slowed enough that it might allow them to steer clear of the reef, but the window of opportunity was narrow, and Adrian knew they were still playing with fire. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and he silently prayed that they wouldn't be too late. The crew continued to battle against the ship's precarious position, their faces etched with exhaustion and desperation. But Adrian's resolve never faltered. He could see the reef now, the sharp coral outcroppings only a few yards away, their jagged edges ready to shred the ship's hull. He held the wheel with a steady hand, the storm's remnants still whipping through the air, but he remained calm, focused on the task at hand. With the sails cut and the rudder barely functioning, it would be up to their remaining skill and determination to navigate the ship away from disaster. The crew's unity and relentless effort would be the deciding factor in whether they lived to sail another day. With gritted determination, Adrian and his crew worked tirelessly to rig a temporary fix for the damaged rudder. The task was arduous, each man pushing past his own exhaustion to make quick repairs under the relentless pressure of time. Adrian barked orders, directing the crew to use ropes and spare parts from the ship's hold to stabilize the rudder enough for them to regain some control. It was a patchwork solution, but it was all they had. As the final adjustments were made, Adrian's grip tightened on the wheel, feeling the subtle shift as the rudder began to respond. Slowly but surely, the Crimson Tempest began to pull away from the reef's grasp, inching away from the jagged rocks that had threatened to tear the ship apart. The water, once a swirling vortex of color and menace, began to settle into a less chaotic rhythm as the ship's movement became more manageable. The crew, though exhausted, moved with renewed focus, their faces lined with the strain of the storm's aftermath. Adrian kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his mind racing as he considered the extent of the damage to the ship. The Crimson Tempest was still afloat, but the ordeal had left its mark. The hull, which had once gleamed proudly under the sun, now bore the deep gouges and scars of the reef's cruel grip. Each scrape and dent was a testament to the battle they had fought, and barely won. The crew, drenched and worn from their efforts, moved about the deck with weary steps, but there was a sense of quiet triumph among them. They had survived the storm and the reef's deadly embrace. Yet, despite their success in steering the ship to safety, the toll of the ordeal was evident. Adrian glanced over at Liam, his first mate, who was coordinating the assessment of the ship's condition. The strain on Liam's face was unmistakable, his normally sharp eyes now clouded with exhaustion. It was clear that the repairs to the rudder were only temporary, and the Crimson Tempest would need more thorough work if they were to sail smoothly again. The ship's crew, though battle-worn, shared a bond that had only grown stronger through their struggle. Adrian could feel the weight of their exhaustion as he surveyed the deck, noting the hunched shoulders and tired eyes of the men who had fought so hard to save the ship. But there was no time to linger in fatigue. The Crimson Tempest still had a long journey ahead, and its crew needed to ensure the ship was fit to continue. As they worked together to assess the damage and secure the rigging, the steady rhythm of their movements spoke of the trust and unity they shared, a bond forged in the crucible of danger. As the final repairs were made, Adrian stood at the helm, feeling the ship's renewed strength beneath his hands. The rudder was still unstable, but for the moment, it was enough. The Crimson Tempest had pulled free from the reef, but the threat of further damage remained. The hull, though holding firm, had taken a beating, and it would require time and skill to fully repair it. Adrian's thoughts were already on the future. There were many challenges ahead, and while the crew had proved their resilience, It was clear that they would need to be vigilant if they were to navigate the treacherous waters that lay before them. The sun, now setting low on the horizon, cast a dim golden light over the crimson tempest, a stark contrast to the fierce battle they had just survived. The ocean, once a churning battlefield, had calmed into a tranquil expanse, as though in acknowledgement of their victory. But the peace was fleeting, and Adrian knew that the danger was far from over. The reef had been but one obstacle in a much larger journey, and they would need to remain ever watchful as they sailed forward. With the ship's rudder temporarily repaired and the crew beginning to recover, Adrian allowed himself a brief moment of relief. But he was a captain, and his focus was always on the horizon, ready for whatever challenges the sea would throw their way next. As the crimson tempest slowly drifted into safer waters, Adrian took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the tension in his chest begin to ease. The ship, still afloat but battered, creaked as the waves, now less tumultuous, rocked it gently. Adrian's gaze swept over the vessel, assessing the damage with a grim expression. The magical reef, once a place of wonder and mystery, had proven to be a far more formidable adversary than they had anticipated. It was no longer a treasure to be admired but a deadly force to be reckoned with, its jagged edges having scraped deep into the hull, leaving scars that would take time and skill to repair. The crew had worked tirelessly to prevent further damage, but there was no escaping the evidence of the reef's destructive power. The ship's once proud sails were torn and ragged, the canvas ripped in several places by the violent forces of the storm and the reef's unforgiving grasp. The rudder, though temporarily fixed, was far from reliable, and Adrian knew it would need more thorough repairs if they were to continue their journey safely. Even the deck, where the crew had fought so desperately to regain control, showed signs of wear, with planks splintered and some sections near the waterline already beginning to swell. Adrian's heart sank as he realized just how close they had come to losing everything. Despite the damage, the crew was already at work, moving with a quiet determination to make the necessary repairs. There were no complaints, no words of frustration, only the steady rhythm of men doing what had to be done. Liam, ever the steadfast first mate, was already organizing the crew into teams to inspect the hull and secure the sails. Adrian watched them for a moment, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. They had survived the storm and the reef's merciless attack, but they were not yet out of danger. The ship might have been saved, but the work ahead of them was just beginning. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he gazed at the horizon, his thoughts already racing ahead. The sea was vast, and they had only scratched the surface of its many dangers. The magical reef, with its eerie glow and hidden power, had been just one challenge among many. And though they had survived, Adrian knew it was not the last of the reef's mysteries they had encountered. There were whispers of treasure hidden deep within those waters, of ancient magic that could turn the tide of any journey. But those same whispers spoke of the reef's deadly nature, how it could tear apart any ship foolish enough to venture too close without understanding the forces at play. Turning his attention back to the ship, Adrian's gaze lingered on the crew, their faces drawn with exhaustion but determined. They had weathered the storm and the reef's wrath, and now they would rebuild. He knew that their survival depended on more than just the strength of their ship. It was their unity, their ability to work together in the face of adversity, that had seen them through. The Crimson Tempest was damaged, yes, but it was not beyond saving. Neither was the crew. Adrian's heart swelled with a sense of gratitude and resolve. He would not let this setback defeat them. Adrian's mind raced as he considered their next steps. With the damage to the rudder and the sails, their progress would be slow, and they would need to find shelter soon to make more extensive repairs. But for now, they had a moment of respite. The sea had calmed, the worst of the storm was behind them, and the horizon was no longer a harbinger of doom, but a promise of safety. Adrian took another breath, allowing the fresh air to fill his lungs as he steadied himself for the work ahead. There was still much to do, and much to discover. But one thing was certain, the Crimson Tempest and its crew would endure. "Patch up what you can," Adrian instructed, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. His eyes scanned the damage with a sharp, calculating gaze, noting every tear in the sails, every gash along the hull. The storm had left its mark on the Crimson Tempest, but they weren't out of danger yet. His crew, though weary, responded quickly, moving with purpose as they began assessing the damage and doing what they could to keep the ship afloat. Adrian knew there was no time to waste. The sea was never truly calm for long, and they had to be ready for whatever came next. "We'll need to make repairs before we can continue," he continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. There was no question in his mind that the ship's damage could be fixed. It was the question of how long it would take and whether they could hold out long enough. The rudder needed serious attention, and the sails would have to be replaced or at least reinforced to ensure they could catch the wind. The hull was battered though not breached yet, but Adrian knew it was only a matter of time before the damage started to take its toll. The tempest had weathered the worst of it, but the work ahead would test their strength and resolve. The crew worked in silence, a few murmuring quietly to each other as they scrambled to retrieve tools and materials from below deck. They had been through storms before, some worse than this, but none had left the ship in such a vulnerable state. It wasn't just the physical damage that weighed heavily on Adrian, it was the toll the storm had taken on their spirits. He could see it in the crew's faces, the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty. Even the toughest sailors could be broken by something like this. But Adrian wasn't about to let that happen. Not now, not when they were so close to finding whatever lay ahead on the horizon. "And keep a weather eye out," Adrian added, his voice hardening with urgency. This storm may have been the first of many. He knew the sea had a way of throwing curveballs when least expected, and if they didn't remain vigilant, the next storm could be their last. The winds were calming for now, but the air still carried the weight of something unsettling. The smell of the salt water mixed with the faint scent of ozone, a sure sign that more bad weather might be lurking just beyond the horizon. The crew's eyes were trained on the sky as they worked, scanning for the first sign of clouds, of wind changing direction, of anything that might signal the next threat. Liam, Adrian's ever-reliable first mate, moved up beside him, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. "Aye, Captain," Liam muttered, rubbing his hand over his brow. "We'll patch her up as best as we can, but we'll need to find a safe harbor soon to make proper repairs." Adrian nodded, knowing Liam's words were true. They couldn't keep pushing the ship this hard. It needed time to recover. They all did. But there was a long stretch of sea between them and any known safe ports, and that meant relying on their skill and luck to make it through. Adrian's gaze drifted out over the horizon once more, his thoughts momentarily lost in the vast expanse of the ocean. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the water, but it wasn't enough to mask the unease gnawing at him. This storm had been fierce, unpredictable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was only the beginning. Their journey had already proven to be one of hardship, but Adrian was resolute. He wouldn't allow the Crimson Tempest to fall. They would face whatever came next together, and they would rise from the wreckage stronger than before. But first, they had to survive. The crew moved in quiet synchronization, their actions deliberate despite their exhaustion. Some worked to secure the rigging, others patched up torn sails, and a few tended to the damaged hull, their hands skilled but weary from the relentless storm. Every movement seemed to carry the weight of the hardships they had endured, yet there was no hesitation in their efforts. The Crimson Tempest had withstood nature's fury, but it had come at a cost. It was clear that the ship would need time to heal, and so would its crew. But for now, they focused on the task at hand, making the necessary repairs to keep the vessel afloat and ready for whatever lay ahead. Adrian stood at the bow, his hands gripping the ship's rail as he watched his crew work. The storm had left its mark on both the ship and the men who sailed her, but Adrian's resolve remained unshaken. His gaze was fixed on the distant horizon, where the sea stretched out endlessly, both a promise of adventure and a reminder of the dangers that awaited them. The ship had survived the reef's cruel grasp, but it wasn't just the ship that needed to recover. Adrian could sense the weariness in the crew's hearts. They had faced an ordeal that would haunt them, yet the journey wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Adrian's shoulders, and the strain of leadership was etched into the lines of his face. He knew that the Crimson Tempest could not weather many more storms like this one. They were far from home, and even farther from any safe haven. But Adrian had always thrived in uncertainty, and the sea was no stranger to him. He had faced countless perils before, and each time he had come out stronger. He trusted in the strength of his crew, in their unwavering loyalty, and in their ability to face the unknown together. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. As the crew worked tirelessly, Adrian's mind wandered to the adventure that lay ahead. The reef, though beautiful, had been a stark reminder of the dangers the sea could throw at them. But it had also been a clue, an indication that there was more to the ocean's mysteries than they had realized. Ancient magic pulsed beneath the surface, hidden and powerful. And if the reef was any indication, their journey would lead them to even more ancient wonders, long-forgotten secrets that could change the course of their lives. Adrian had always sought treasure, but now he was beginning to see that the true treasure might not be gold or jewels, but the knowledge and magic that lay buried in the deep. With a deep breath, Adrian pulled his thoughts back to the present. The Crimson Tempest was no longer in imminent danger, but that didn't mean their troubles were over. The sea was unpredictable, and they had already seen how quickly a calm horizon could turn into a nightmare. The crew's repairs would take time, but they couldn't afford to linger for too long. Adrian knew that, as long as they were out here, they would have to be prepared for anything, whether that meant facing more storms, hidden enemies, or the very magic that seemed to pulse from the sea itself. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the ocean, Adrian's mind hardened with resolve. The Crimson Tempest had survived, but now they had to chart a course forward. Whatever the future held, Adrian was ready. His crew was ready. They had come this far, and they would continue onward, seeking out new adventures, facing challenges head-on, and discovering the secrets of the sea that lay just beyond the horizon. The storm was behind them now, but the real adventure, perhaps the greatest one yet, was just beginning.